Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, Cabbage Head Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the 11th part of What If Badass Deku Becomes Ronin? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The school day started with Kaminari in the recovery ward, waking late to a dull ache spreading through his body. He was already missing first hour, and by the time Recovery Girl had checked him out and given him the okay to leave, the clock was starting to push into the second, more so when he finally got to class. Luckily, the class he'd been partially skipping was math, so his pain kept to just the physical kind for now. Ectoplasm saw Kaminari to his seat, then continued teaching on like normal. In a way, this was normal. Hero Corps students did get often injured, as professional heroes did in the real world. One of the girls in his class, Uraraka, had her legs crushed just in the entrance exam, so it was little wonder that the class would just keep trucking, same as normal. Or so Kaminari thought. But as class ended and their break started, Kaminari found himself suddenly the center of attention. Surrounded by the rest of Exam F, he was bombarded with praise from all sides, with some even from the Tsundere Bakugo. A rare treat indeed. How many in the class could say they got a compliment from Bakugo, even if it was a little backhanded? Kaminari smiled through it, and even some of the other students chimed in just to see what was going on, with Exam F retelling the story of his fight against Ronin to everyone. It started with Kaminari blushing, but as he went on, it seemed to go a little different than he remembered. From the outside, his moves were being described as cool and flashy, the kind of thing that he remembered Ronin's moves being. They talked about how he made his big moves, his insane speed, and how strong he pushed himself. But they didn't mention that his big flashy moves didn't land once and that his own insane speed was the reason he had so many bruises and burns. Was this why Ronin had such styles? In a moment of self-reflection, Kaminari compared his fighting style to Ronin's, finding them fairly similar. His style was based on Ronin's. Maybe Ronin had a similar experience to his. Maybe that was the fight all of 1A had seen back in the summer training camp. That was kind of wild. Kaminari was distracted by his thoughts through all of computer tech, learning Jack's sheet from his teacher as he instead turned it over in his mind. If Ronin had hit a roadblock in his own style before, then that should mean that his current style was the solution Ronin had thought up. It was definitely a weird style, just standing around and letting your opponent do everything. But maybe that only worked against opponents who were really fast? Like the best way to counter a button masher was to build a little distance, then use the steadier moves that couldn't be countered on accident. Lunch came and went for most of 1A fast as could be, the students heading off in droves to claim their seats and meals. Kaminari got a small ways with his friends before he had to break off to visit the medical ward and get his last look over before he went to training. Recovery Girl looked over Kaminari's legs with a careful eye, making all sorts of little sounds to herself as she wrote something down on her clipboard. Kaminari was sitting down, with his breaths rolled up above the knee to show off his legs. He had been swathed in bandaging, ice packs, and compresses last night all while he slept, but now only the compresses for his knees and ankles sat next to him on the bed. He got those compresses handed right back to him as Recovery Girl finished her inspection. "You're lucky you're young." Recovery Girl shook her head at Kaminari, but helped him put the compresses back around his leg joints as she gave him the basics. "As long as you don't push your limbs, you should be fine. Don't carry anything over 50 kilos, no running, and no using your quirk. I'll know if you did. If you can manage all of that." Recovery Girl's expression softened as she helped Kaminari to his feet, smiling up at him as she gingerly patted his leg. "If you can keep your pace down, I'm sure our next meeting will be our last, for this problem at least." Kaminari nodded for a second, then thought it over and realized just how confusing that was. "Wait, if I can't lift 40 kilos or run, how am I supposed to train today? I've got to practice for the big exam thing coming up." "I'm sure Ronin can cook up something for you to do, sweetie," Recovery Girl said in a sweet but firm tone, pushing the boy's shoes next to him. "Making a training regiment for someone who's injured? I dare say that'll be one of the easiest things he's done this year." Kaminari sighed, reflecting on Ronin for a moment and all the problems he must have gone through. Fighting at the camp, nearly dying, escaping capture, and then having to deal with his sloppy apprentice twice now. Or did this still count as just dealing with him once, and it was a lot longer than he first thought? Either way, not a great look for him. Kaminari rubbed the back of his head, tying his shoes and seeing himself out with 2 notices, one for a special high-energy food to go for lunch rush, and one as an exception to any strong elbier for Ronin. Reading the second one over as he made his way to the cafeteria, Kaminari wondered if he could hide it and still get some training in. But then, Recovery Girl did say she'd know if he didn't follow her advice, and plus there was no way Ronin wouldn't notice either. Did he really think he could pull the wool over that guy's eyes? This whole mess left Kaminari's head spinning as he made his way to the cafeteria, getting his food just in time for lunch to end, and being stuck running after his class before Aizawa shouted at him to walk. This was going to be a long training exercise. This stayed slow as 1A rolled up to the gyms. With UA's freeform teaching, the students were left completely to their own devices in the gyms. Sure, Ectoplasm was there to make clones to fight, and Cementos was overseeing the grounds, but actually figuring out what you'd be doing was up to the students. Exam F had it a little easier than the rest, naturally drawn to the neighboring gym where they found their private teacher already waiting. Ronin was waiting for them 20 or so feet from the entrance, with his bag of tricks open but resting innocuously to one side. The small man himself was leaning against a wall, reading a book very familiar to the ones recovered from the summer training campgrounds, the training books made for each of the members. Examf only had a few moments to look at the book before Ronin snapped the notes shut, pushing himself off the wall and walking forward with a smile to greet them. We'll be repeating the order we fought in yesterday for training. Ronin skipped straight into the rules, tapping a whiteboard in the general area of the gymnasium between the entrance and the faux city. The names of Exam F, save Monoma, were written there in order and timed for when they'd SWH in and out. To make sure everyone gets a fair amount of time, though, we won't be doing any repeat training, that way, everyone gets one slot with me, to use however you see fit. Any questions? Bakugo grumbled, but most of the cast were happy to go along with this. There were only 3 hours left in school anyway, split between 6 of them, with breaks between them. They were going to be short for time before anybody got 2 slots with Teach. Excellent, then Bakugo's up. Kirishima, you're on deck, so it's up to you to get here in time for your lesson to start? Ronin made brief eye contact with each student as he spoke to them, staying still as he finished his address to them and dismissed them. The rest of you, I'll see you at your training PRDS. Good luck, now dismissed. And with a dramatic turn causing his coattails to flare up, Ronin moved to the city with Bakugo close in time, ready to begin. The training itself wasn't that interesting, and in fact, it was fairly similar to yesterday's work. Bakugo spent most of his time using Ronin as a live target, training his aim against a high-speed target to practice his longer-ranged attacks. This was a pretty good use of his time, in Midoriya's head at least. While most of Exam F could practice against robots, the robots weren't mobile enough to pose a real threat like he could jumping over walls, weaving through buildings, and that sort of thing. The unpredictability of a real human was strong to match. This was, ironically, one of the easiest training exercises for Midoriya to do, both because of how simple it was and because Bakugo had a clear idea of what he wanted to spend the training time doing. Even better, Midoriya knew how to help him, advising him to try skeet shooting in his own time as you definitely had a skeet shooter somewhere in its mess of halls, robots, and other junk. The small tidbits of time not spent chasing were used to fine-tune some of Bakugo's ultimate's moves. There wasn't a lot of work on that front. They had 3 more days to work it out, but deciding which moves needed to be safer and which ones should be stronger was an easy enough starting point. By the time Bakugo's time wrapped up, he had spent over 20 minutes chasing Midoriya through the cement streets while they shouted ideas at one another. Seeing Bakugo off with a smile as Kirishima came in, Midoriya mused that this was probably the closest they'd ever been. How things had changed, and how some stayed the same. Midoriya had unfortunately predicted what would happen next. The last time he had trained with Kirishima, the young man who was only a few months younger than him didn't have a clue what he wanted his ultimate move to be. Hell, last time, Kirishima didn't even know how he wanted to use his training time. It seemed that, unfortunately, Kirishima still didn't know what he wanted to do. Not for a lack of trying, if his exasperated expression was anything to go by. I'm sorry, Teachta. Kirishima couldn't quite meet Midoriya's gaze, staring off to the side while laughing nervously. He seemed to be thinking strong, but creating an ultimate move for a defensive quirk like his wasn't easy. It's fine not to have an ultimate move, you know. Midoriya tried to console him with a few hero facts, like a few statistics you could find online if you searched. 85% of heroes have ultimate moves, but most don't use them in their fights. In fact, an ultimate move is usually used more for publicity than to actually win a fight in modern heroics. Yeah, and I can't even do that. Kirishima seemed more disheartened by this, looking at his hands sadly. A dull quirk that can't even do an ultimate move? That's like dullness squared or something. Well, at least Midoriya had enough sense to say this was the wrong angle to try and approach it from. He such tactics, shaking his head. Heroes like Eraserhead and Death Arms don't have ultimate moves, and they're still pretty popular. At least, Eraserhead's as popular as an underground hero can be. A quirk itself doesn't have to be flashy or manly, it can be in the user. After all, Midoriya trailed off as he realized that, even if he brought up a bad idea to start, Kirishima would have no idea who the F he was talking about. All bringing that jackass up would do is raise questions. Kirishima thought over the name, tilting his head to one side as he chewed on it. Gotta be honest, Teach. I don't think I've ever heard of a hero named Mao. That's not a very heroic name either. While Mao's actual name was just gibberish, translating as a kind of movement into Japanese, it sounded pretty similar to Mao, a word that translated roughly as a super powerful supernatural creature of supreme evil. And holy shit, that was probably what Mao intended his name to be, but his own shitty pronunciation of Japanese turned Mao into Mao. That offended. It took all of Midoriya's will not to facepalm or scream Mao's name in frustration, or rather, scream Mao's name in frustration, but he could deal with that dumbass later. He goes by Yakuza Hunter right now. Thinking over how to spin it, Revenant tried to lean into it. In a way, Mao was a great example as he almost stumbled into, despite having 3 quirks, Mao's fighting style revolved almost entirely around his hype and the many things he could pull off because of it. Hype itself was a very simple quirk, with no discernible tell, save for the incredible damage it could shrug off, which was badass in its own way. In that way, he was the perfect ideal for Kirishima and what the young man was looking for. As long as he didn't idealize Mao's shitty personality. But he's a great fighter you could learn a lot from. Midoriya avoided calling Mao a great person, sticking to this route to hopefully make some progress. While he talked, he tried to think if Mao, or whatever the hell he was supposed to be called had any ultimate moves he could steal and teach to Kirishima. His quirk is very similar to yours, a pure defense quirk, with a mostly hand-to-hand fighting style too. Midoriya let his mumbling take the reins, but even thinking through all his thoughts, it was pretty clear Mao didn't have any real ultimate moves. When he met, Mao had tried to demolish the building they were fighting in and called that an ultimate move, but dropping buildings on people wasn't a very heroic thing to do. Even with a simple and plain quirk, though, he's one of the strongest people I know. Even without an ultimate move, Mao was a beast though. There was a reason even Midoriya could call him the main man even if his Japanese was shit. With just his quirk, some martial arts, and a ton of confidence, he's taken on as many as 12 men at once. He's been surrounded, shot, outmanned, but never outmatched. Kirishima was surprisingly interested in Midoriya's ramblings, leaning forward a little as he listened. 12 people? At once? His quirk must be pretty awesome. It is awesome. Midoriya couldn't deny Mao's quirk, not while being honest, but there was more to it than that. But it's nothing without the person using it. Yakuza Hunter is a great martial artist, and it's in his hands and with his confidence that he's able to take his quirk so far. It's one thing to shrug off bullets, but it's another to walk towards them. Kirishima looked at Midoriya in amazement, probably a little unsure if this was a tall tale or a true story. His eyes flicked down to 2 things under Midoriya's coat. I don't know if I'm even bulletproof. Do you think we could? They'd gotten so far without doing any actual training, and still without a real direction. just talking. Midoriya wondered if this was the right direction, but maybe Kirishima could use whatever they talked about here to train himself, but shooting himself just for practice? No way. It's not safe. Kirishima was definitely a little bummed by Ronin's response, pushing it harder. But isn't training the safest place to practice this sort of stuff? It's better to do it here than in the field. It's better to never do it, Midoriya countered, but that was a weak argument. As a combat hero, especially in this day and age, Kirishima would probably encounter things a lot worse than a few 9mm bullets in just his first year of being a hero. That's why he had to nod along in spite of what he said, even if he didn't like it. But it is safer to do it here in training, but it's not something you should just do on a whim. Revenant reorganized his thoughts, listing a few real reasons far better than a hero shouldn't have to face bullets. If I shoot you and you can't harden enough to stop the bullet, that's it. If you freeze up for a moment, or have a second of weakness when I shoot you, that's it. You're going to be injured and sitting out like Kaminari is today at best, and right before an important exam like the provisional license. Against a real argument, Kirishima didn't have a defense, ironic again. Now though, Midoriya could turn this on its head and stop dragging Kirishima down and give him some good news. Even if I won't shoot you, not right now at least, you can still get some practice with it. Your classmate Bakugo can generate the same force as a bullet and more. If you're looking for training, try training against him. It'd be good practice for both of you, testing how strong you can become and seeing how powerful his explosions can get. It was a win-win situation, even if it wasn't what Bakugo was looking for. He wasn't sure how well the students got along, but he figured with his good standing he might be able to convince Bakugo to do it next time they trained together, but by Kirishima's expression, maybe he wouldn't have to. Yeah, we can do that. Thanks, teach. Kirishima gave him a hearty slap on the shoulder, smiling a little wider. With this defense training, Kirishima finally had a direction to go in. Now, it was time to start making some strides. You can do that once you're done here, Kirishima. Ronin returned the smack with about the same amount of force, then drew his kanabo from his coat to warm up. For now, I'll get you started. We'll do some basics to get you into the swing of things. On your mark dash. Go! Using the kanabo, Midoriya had been able to get some training in with Kirishima. Sure, it wasn't nearly as powerful as a bullet, but practicing blocking a big heavy club was good practice in itself. The main thing was, even if Midoriya's style didn't pair well to train against Kirishima, with an item he could. This was not the case with Sato. Alright dash. Sato shouted with ample spirit as he and Midoriya squared up, rushing in confidently against Midoriya's sword. Since their last match, Sato had gone to the support department, getting some new gauntlets to defend against things like sword strikes so he could push through Ronin's sword swings. Midoriya still used a shurnai, a wooden practice sword, to avoid cutting Sato in case one of his attacks got through, but already the gauntlets had changed the entire fight. Sato's quirk made him stronger when he took in sugar, and with just a little bit he was already a match for Midoriya in terms of sheer muscle. With a bit more, he could overpower Midoriya even with the bodysuit, allowing him to bat around Midoriya's sword with his bare hands and dive in for the attack. This part was where Midoriya hit the snag. While his sword skills could keep Sato out all day if he tried strong enough, the point of this was to train and improve, so Midoriya held back to give Sato a chance, such as telegraphing his attacks, not going full speed, and keeping his movements more predictable. This way, Sato had a fair chance of actually getting past the shurnai and reaching Midoriya, where the problem occurred. Izuka Midoriya was only 143 pounds on his own. With his gear, you could easily stack on over 80 pounds mostly from the bodysuit. The problem was that Sato could lift around 200 pounds with one hand, and so once he so much as touched Midoriya with just one hand, bam! Midoriya was tossed like a rag doll yet again by Sato, bouncing roughly down the street and rolling to his feet. Once Sato grabbed him, the Vigilante had no choice but to try and use a weapon to attack Sato in close quarters, or else lose immediately. The problem was he could only take so much throwing before he needed to take a second and regain his bearings, so Ronin prepared to jump back but stumbled as his head swam. It was no surprise as Sato took advantage of this slip-up, rushing in and grabbing the shurnai to toss it aside before grabbing Ronin by his coat and pinning him to the wall with a confident smile. "Looks like this wins mine, sensei." Ronin glanced down at himself, wiggling a bit but clearly impressed. He nodded approvingly, then smiled at Sato. "Looks about right to me, Sato. How are those gauntlets?" As Sato talked about his new gauntlet, Ronin worried if this training was doing any good. He could keep slowly picking up the speed of his sword strokes, but he was a lot faster than Sato, plain and simple, and had little doubt Sato wouldn't keep up with his top speed. The problem was that Ronin just wasn't heavy enough to actually give Sato a challenge at wrestling. It wasn't too big of a problem right now, there was plenty of training to do with finesse. Sato's gauntlets could only block attacks if he could react to them, after all, so as they reset and began again, they weren't wasting time. The problem was, in modern heroics, giant villains were common as hell, and they really could give Sato the pushback Ronin had no chance of doing. That was why, as time ran thin, Ronin encouraged Sato to keep training against robots and perhaps large pillars of concrete, just to get used to the weight. It was a little extreme, but if Sato could toss around pillars of concrete, he'd definitely be able to handle the heavier villains he ran against. With minutes turning into seconds, Ronin and Sato bid each other farewell, earning the Vigilante a full 5 minutes of respite before the next exercise began, a time he wouldn't fully get to use as Siro arrived early, excited to begin, and giving the Vigilante a few ideas of what he wanted to train. While most of the students trained in martial combat, Siro had decided to push himself in a different direction: mobility. Instead of wanting to spar against Ronin, Siro asked about ways he could safely train his moves. While he sure could practice his tape SWNGNG in the cement city, if he F'd up, he'd be really F'd up for a while and it would hurt like hell, if he was lucky. There were far better places to practice SWNGNG from great heads than over a bed of concrete. Thus, the quest began to find somewhere good to train. In all of UA's massive budget, they had to have spent some of their money making a mobility training center, but finding it on their own would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Asking the local teachers like Cementos and Ectoplasm, though, made it a whole lot easier. Once they finally discovered Basement Omega, an underground section of school that was yet another faux city, this time made out of soft materials to be sturdy yet safe to crash into, almost all of Siro's time had been spent, and Ronin had to head back just to make it to his next lesson in time. Still, it was good to know it existed, and he'd run it by a few of his more mobile students to see if they wanted to train there. For example, Mina was completely okay with going straight back to Basement Omega to practice her moves. In her free time, she'd been thinking of a few ultimate moves, but she seemed confident with them and instead insisted that she get some more movement practice. And so, with Siro SWNGNG up top as their only company, Mina chased and was chased all around the city. It was more of a workout for Ronin, the guy who was running everywhere while Mina just slid and skated around the streets, but Mina did have some movement tricks she needed to learn, namely, planning her route. Numerous times she cornered herself because of poor planning, or she'd chase Ronin somewhere she couldn't follow, like up a flight of stairs. It only took a few steps to completely stop Mina in her tracks, something she'd have to get around if she wanted to be a hero with great mobility. But that was a hurdle, or in this case, staircase, she'd have to clear some other time as Ronin had one last lesson in him before he was done. The day was full of minor work here and there, and while the work was strong but usually brief, it served more as an endurance test than anything else. From suching his mindset for each student to trying to keep up with them, Midoriya was tuckered out. It was clear his injuries were having a bigger effect on him than he realized. Maybe someday he'd be able to run around in high gear all day like he had back in the summer camp, but that was something he'd do another day. Right now, Ronin had one last lesson in him before he was done, and while it was physically the easiest, it was definitely going to be his mentally hardest one. Midoriya greeted Kaminari and Eraserhead with a smile on his face and even managed to maintain that smile as he took a long list from Eraserhead of all the things Kaminari wasn't allowed to do. No quirk use, no strenuous leg motion, no weight beyond 50 kilos. At some point, they probably should have told Kaminari to keep lying down, and Midoriya thought that point was roughly 6 bullet points in. So, Kaminari, Ronin said as he read the list over one more time, one by one scratching off all the training exercises he couldn't do. No long running, no weighted squats, no quirk control practice. Almost everything Ronin had thought up for Kaminari was to increase his endurance, both to his own quirk and in general, allowing him to fight for longer at full power, but it seemed that was the one thing he wasn't allowed to do. So that left the question, what have you been practicing so far? Ronin figured smarter people than him must have come up with something for Kaminari to do if he was out here in the training hall. Unfortunately, this was self-study, meaning if Kaminari was gonna do something, he'd have to think it up himself. Kaminari himself seemed pretty aware of this problem, by the slightly nervous way he acted even before Ronin questioned him. A shifting gaze, a tapping foot, mostly the way he kept playing with his costume zipper. Kaminari was distracted, significantly more than usual. So far? Well, I've read over my notes, did some stretches, looked around at what the other students were doing. Kaminari trailed off, aware that while he'd been doing something he probably hadn't been working, seeming to let down his teacher once more. Little did he know his teacher was thinking he'd done the same to his favorite student, Ronin shaking his head as he tried to cook up something they could do together. Well, how's your equipment? Ronin got an outlet when his hand brushed his new two-part helmet. Sato hadn't developed any new skills, but just by adjusting his equipment to include gauntlets, he drastically increased the situations he could deal with, and Sato said the gauntlets were still being worked on and improved right now. If you can't work on your body, you can work on your kit. I've been doing my best, but... Kaminari and Ronin moved towards the edge of the cement city, sitting on the sidewalk as Kaminari opened his hero equipment suitcase, including the maintenance kits for them, but there wasn't that much to maintain. Kaminari's hero outfit was a L-teacher jacket, an earpiece, a vest Ronin made for him, and his sword. Of all those, only the sword needed regular maintenance to make sure it wasn't bent out of shape, but after the last fight you could bet your butt it was. Kaminari had bent it so badly it couldn't even be sheathed, and was currently in the support course getting straightened out. Still, there were a few things to touch up. Ronin picked up Kaminari's sheath and a screwdriver, checking the internals. Kaminari's sword worked with a flywheel design to increase his draw speed, using his quirk as a power source. Opening it up, Kaminari watched with an odd bit of excitement and curiosity as Ronin inspected those internal mechanisms, humming and hawing to himself. But Kaminari looked from the sheath to Ronin, his nerves palpable. "So, what are we looking at?" "Just keeping it clean." Ronin opened the sheath fully, then turned it upside down and began to brush it, removing small bits of dust and debris. "If you treat your equipment right, it will work right. Here, your turn." Ronin handed Kaminari the brush, letting him pick up the other half of the sheath for himself and get to work. Ronin watched as he worked, trying to speak as little as possible and give Kaminari some space to work, which is how he liked to work, but Kaminari wasn't such a loner as he immediately gravitated right back even as Ronin tried to back off. "So, how often do you do this stuff for your sword?" Kaminari held the sheath up, squinting at it, then holding it higher to try inspecting it, poking something inside it. "Sheet, that's a scratch. Write that down for a service ticket. The support course should fix that before your next practice session if you let them know early enough." Ronin leaned over, inspecting the scratch, a sign of a bad sheath. Kaminari must have shoved his sword into the sheath backwards so the blade poked the internals instead of sliding inside. But for me, I probably don't do this enough. With all his self-maintenance, Ronin had been more focused on putting his own body back in shape instead of his gear. Sure, he fixed the tears in his jackets and replaced his bulletproof armor regularly, but there was more he could do, cleaning his guns, checking the electronics, and inspecting the normal parts to see if there were any parts that needed to be replaced. Kindness was hit so strong a week ago that the barrel of the pistol now had a scratch near the slide. He should definitely hit up Mao the next chance he got to see if he could get a replacement part. But this talk of kit did give Ronin a direction to move in, and a little lesson in it. He could never forget the equipment that he broke. Was it his poor maintenance? Had it been Muscular's attacks? Did he push it too strong? Who could truly say? The lessons that stick with us the best are the ones that come from our mistakes, so learn from mine. Keep checking up on your weapons. You wouldn't want a failure in the field, like your sword snapping in two. Kaminari laughed at the thought, not realizing how literal the lesson was as he nodded. "Yeah, you see that headpiece, sensei? I can use that to tune into radio frequencies in my phone, but sometimes when I try to go all out, I fry the thing. I'm pretty sure some of the wires get crossed, or maybe it just can't handle too much juice. Heh. Ronin nodded along. Kaminari probably fried it by just putting too much power in, which might have made some of the protective material on the wires melt, making them cross and turning it from a piece of equipment to a piece of fashion. As long as you stay on it and keep bringing it up with whoever designs your equipment, they should keep working on it. Make the most of it. You'll have to pay for that kind of help once you leave UA. Ronin couldn't think of much other equipment Kaminari could need. He had all the basics. Most of Ronin's usual upgrades, like body armor, would slow down Kaminari. Ronin could wear so much equipment because the muscle suit enhanced his strength, and because his uniform was designed to distribute the weight across his body evenly. Despite being taller, Kaminari weighed less than Midoriya, probably less than Midoriya even without their equipment, from all the dense muscle Midoriya had been packing on since he started. But if there wasn't new equipment to make, there was one to improve. Get better with one's equipment. So, yesterday was a sheet show. With your laundry list of things you can't do, it's clear we can't work out your body, but your technique? Ronin trailed off as he put his hands on his knees and stood, working his left arm a bit before moving to his duffel bag and drawing 2 new shurnai made just for today. Grab a sword, Kaminari, and clear your head. Yesterday you showed off your passion, now we're gonna see your skill. Finish your Gatorade, then grab a sword, we've got some work to do. Kaminari looked up, nodding with eyes widening and a smile growing as he moved to chug his drink and stand. After you put your sheath back together. And start screwing the sheath back together, setting it aside, and then standing with a bounce in his step as he moved towards his teacher, excited and eager to redeem himself. Sir, Kaminari fiddled with his practice sword, poking his finger between bamboo strips while Midoriya finished his own setup, just moving his bag to the side. It wasn't that complicated, just picking a random street to square up on. A slightly familiar street. Cementos had done such a good job cleaning up the city, you couldn't even see the bloodstains and scratches in the faux city from the last fight that scarred this area. Midoriya stopped inspecting the street, rising from a crouch with his shurnai resting against his shoulder. Still no guard, still relaxed as he looked over his student. Whenever you're ready, Kaminari. Kaminari glanced at him, then back to the shurnai in his own hands, slowly taking a stance with his feet apart and his sword pointing at Midoriya. The tip wobbled and drooped slightly between the reed that was Kaminari and the rock that was Ronin. Hiya! Kaminari made a weak battle cry as he lunged forward, going in for an overhead attack with one big step and a bigger swing, his sword swung wildly, biting nothing but air as Ronin stepped to the side. Ronin's face seemed to follow the sword as it cleanly missed, his own sword gently rising off his shoulder and twirling around to tap Kaminari on the shoulder. The blow was so soft that Kaminari didn't react, just stepping back and preparing for another attack when Ronin reset himself after landing the first blow, but Kaminari took a second to realize what just happened, his guard fully dropping and then grabbing his arm that had just been struck, gently tapped. Wait, what? Kaminari slowly wrapped his head around what happened, the little details coming back to him. This wasn't about beating the CRP out of his opponent, this was just about touching them with the stick sword thing. And that meant, he lost. He lost in like 3 seconds. Oh shit. Calm down, Kaminari. Ronin's shurnai returned to his shoulder, held in one hand by a loose grip as the teacher oversaw his student with a relaxed smile. Don't let your emotions overtake you. This is just a warm-up, alright? Whenever you're ready. The double meaning was a little lost on Kaminari, but the reassuring words weren't as Kaminari returned to guard, breathing deeply and holding his sword tight. Then, looking over his own grip compared to Ronin's, gradually loosened his grip. As his grip became more relaxed, so too did his sword. No longer was it wobbling and waving with every strain of his muscles but staying in a much tighter area. Ronin nodded immediately, a wordless approval of Kaminari's actions. They shared a small smile, Kaminari going from so serious to quietly chuckling with his teacher as he replayed the training in his head, and then, they began to train. It was immediately clear that Kaminari was out of practice in what must have been a million ways, And his slow remembrance of how to spar was just another drop in the bucket as the young hero relearned what he'd forgotten bit by bit. Soon, the massive swings shrunk into quick strikes, little movements with much less power but more precision. Maintain control over yourself, Ronin reminded as Kaminari pressed in eagerly, deflecting the hero's attack to one side to leave him stumbling for a moment before the Vigilante's Shurnai struck Kaminari lightly on the leg, then snaked out to hover against the boy's seat to stop him from falling. Hit, called out Kaminari, planting both his feet after a moment and noticing the practice sword that not only caught him but could have delivered a far more serious injury than just a cut leg. Ronin said nothing about it though, merely pushing Kaminari a step back while moving away himself, disengaging after the spar to reset. Put less weight behind your attacks, Ronin repeated. How many times had he given that advice? How many times had he failed to listen to that advice? Ronin worked his arm, chastising himself for being too quick to rush, then returned to his guard. Whenever you're ready. Again Kaminari moved in, still putting too much force into his attacks too early, but it was less. As Ronin stepped past the first swing, Kaminari wasn't pulled forward by his own attack, instead turning to keep his opponent in front of him and attacking again. Ronin turned sideways, putting his Shurnai in his shoulder to Kaminari, then dropping his sword against Kaminari's. Ronin's sword was braced against his body, easily deflecting a sword held in an outstretched limb, and pushing Kaminari off balance again. If Kaminari had been attacking more lightly, it would have just pushed away his arm instead of his whole body. Hit by hit, blow by blow, a rhythm was formed that they both gradually fell into. Kaminari stepped in, striking to Ronin's left, striking the sword, then immediately bouncing off and going for his right. It was still blocked, Ronin pivoting his body and keeping his arms mostly in place to block the next strike, but it wasn't immediately countered. Ronin had to actually dodge as Kaminari's Shurnai bounced off of his defense to build distance, then lunged forward with a move. Ronin backed off, using his own Shurnai to swat away at Kaminari's Shurnai as he parted, but as Kaminari lunged behind his blade he was able to control it more easily by keeping it close, realigning his strike and moving again, then turning it into a small swing at the last minute. That last-minute adjustment caused Ronin's usual parry to miss by a few inches, taking Kaminari's first hit to the forearm. Hit. Good adjustments, Kaminari. The blonde bolt smiled wide as he looked at his handiwork, dampened as he reflected on how long it took, then hardened into a determined smirk as he vowed to make his next hit faster. I'm just getting warmed up, sir. And after all that slowing down, Kaminari and Ronin began to slowly pick up the pace. Multiple attacks became more common, attacking was done while blocking or dodging, and everything slowly became more and more fluid, never reaching the breakneck pace Kaminari started with, but seemingly just as fast somehow. Kaminari couldn't put a finger on why as he blocked Ronin's swift pokes, shifting his position around Ronin and then suddenly switching direction to try and find a gap. He struck once, hitting nothing but air, then pushed forward for a moment to chase down a hit before jumping away, almost taking a hit himself for his troubles. Nice and fluid, Kaminari. Keep it all connected. Ronin's voice had a tinge of pride as he pursued Kaminari, his steps sure and steady as he came forward like a glacier, seemingly slow, but damn near unstoppable. Eyes on my sword tip, Kaminari. Try dodging and attacking. Yes sir. Hit. Keep going. Yes sir. Kaminari began to try just dodging attacks, Ronin switching to more simple strikes to help his student. Somehow, this all felt faster than Kaminari's breakneck attack of yesterday. He couldn't put his finger on why. They were both going so much slower, it was like, objectively slower. He was literally flying around the road yesterday, so why did trying to land a hit against Ronin without getting smacked himself feel so much faster? Unfortunately, Kaminari wasn't good enough at combat to think up the answer himself, and Ronin still hadn't manifested an actual mind-reading quirk, leaving Kaminari to just feel out the vibes as he shifted his focus from attacking and dodging to attacking while dodging, getting some better results as he got hit less even if he landed hits less. Beep. And how time flies, Midoriya mused as he broke off from the fight, turning off the timer on his waistband and dropping his sword point to the ground, bringing his last training to an end. He looked over his final student of the day with pride, proud to see what Kaminari could still do. It seemed like yesterday's disaster was an outlier, not the norm, but that was just his perspective. How do you feel, Kaminari? Tired. With the final 30 minutes up, Kaminari dropped his sword and his butt to the ground, sitting down as he caught his breath. Most training exercises would go 10, maybe 20 minutes, but Midoriya was used to the larger sprawling fights of the streets, usually involving chases in the middle of them as your opponent tried to book it when they realized they weren't going to win. Nothing like a little endurance training to prep for those moments. You did great, Kaminari. Here. Kaminari automatically raised his hands even before Midoriya pulled out the Gatorade, tossing it to his sitting companion and collecting Kaminari's shurnai, then beginning to pack his things. How do you think it went? It took Kaminari a second to answer as he drank deeply. This warehouse was actually kind of hot, with no AC. What had started as a dim dark room quickly heated up as the day went on, and only got worse as the students moved around. Midoriya hardly noticed. He had the muscle suit and its energy-absorbing coolness to cheat the heat, but maybe turning on a little AC tomorrow would be a good idea to stop Kaminari from drinking half his Gatorade in one sitting. The was fast. Even when he finished, Kaminari had to take a few seconds to breathe between his words. Like, that felt fast to you, right? Midoriya nodded. Honestly, the thing they'd just done was about on pace with the Kendo Club, probably slower. The Kendo Club also had tons of difficult terrain, people and things you could accidentally back yourself into, trash you could step on, and extremely battle-hungry opponents who were far more comfortable using sword-like weapons than Kaminari was. But just because it was slower didn't mean this sparring training didn't have some fundamentals hidden in. That speed you're feeling was probably flow, Midoriya explained, putting both shin ace into the duffel bag and then focusing his attention on Kaminari. As you get into a state of flow, your actions lead into one another, creating that sense of speed as you lose less downtime. It's like when you play a video game for a bit, and after what might seem a normal start, you slowly get faster as you get used to it and better weave everything together. By better using your dodges and attacks, you don't need to do one or the other, you can weave them together, doing two actions at once. That's a simple enough example of flow. Midoriya personally understood it better from a studying sense, getting into a rhythm with reading, writing, and responding to questions. Personally, math was his forte for this sort of thing, but he understood Kaminari enough to know Kaminari wouldn't understand that and probably couldn't relate. As you practice, you'll get better at weaving it all together, dodging and positioning, attacking and positioning, dodging and attacking. Maybe even all three at once. It was a little more complicated than just that, but Midoriya figured that was a good note to end on. Just something to think on between our sessions. Here, Midoriya helped the sweaty student off the floor, nodding appreciatively as he looked up at Kaminari. You did very well, even not counting your injuries. Now go get your rest, you'll need it. Kaminari's smile looked a shade more genuine as he looked over his nodding in turn even if he didn't understand what they were nodding about. Yeah, I will. And I'll see you tomorrow, so you better be ready. Kaminari turned to lightly jog away, ignoring Recovery Girl's words about no big movement until something caught his attention as he made his way to the exit. Midoriya didn't see the exact moment Kaminari slowed to a pause by the door, turning back to shout. Hey sir. Midoriya shouldered the bag, stopping his quick check of his things as he glanced up at Kaminari a little confused. What did Kaminari want? The aspiring hero was in no position to keep training. In fact, Midoriya had only intended to train 20 minutes with him before he got lost in the rhythm of fighting. What did he want to say? Thanks. Kaminari started strong, stumbling a bit as he tried to figure out what he wanted to say, then just went with his instinct as his voice raised to a shout, glowing with joy as he spoke. Thanks for coming back. Midoriya didn't get to respond as Kaminari laughed, feeling another weight off his shoulders as he ran out of the gym, leaving Midoriya alone. A shame he couldn't see his own soft smile as he adjusted his bag, shaking his head before heading out himself. With some grounds finally set up and the seeds sown, Midoriya was happy to stop working on the basics once again and get to more advanced techniques. He hoped. Sato, Kirishima, and Kaminari had just established their solid grounds, things that they could work to develop further from in their respective new fields even if new wasn't exactly the correct term. Shiro, Mina, and Bakugo were already at the next step though, exploring their field and developing in ways according to their taste. For one side, it'd be best to let them explore around to pick something they like, and for the other Midoriya would try to match his training to their chosen paths. It didn't take much to rework Midoriya's original training plans, so he was almost finished before he even left UA, leaving him with plenty of time to himself for his training. Running in circles, doing push-ups, pull-ups, and a whole bunch of workouts until Midoriya got to feel exactly what his students had felt hours ago. You sure like getting yourself into some weird but shit? Centipider, Mao said from above Midoriya as he practiced his man-ups, something very important for trying to scale a building. It was like a pull-up, but instead of just trying to reach his chin to the bar, he was trying to get over it, with both chin, shoulders, and even hips. Very useful at the end of climbing a wall and making your arms feel like they were about to fall off. Training kids, training yourself, beating the shit out of punks, you got time for a hobby and all that? Beating punks is my hobby. Midoriya made some interesting faces as he tried to do his fifth man-up. He was generally pretty good at them with his small stature and lightweight, but being good at it and being able to do a bunch of them were separate things. The fact that he could do even one put him well above most, and his ability to do almost 5 wasn't one to be looked down upon, even if his form deteriorated to garbage and his body swung in every direction but up. Are you sure self-torture ain't ya thin? Mao watched Midoriya's wiggling effort with a raised eyebrow, swing around like a fish on a hook as the young vigilante tried to get his elbows above the bar so he could push down and finish the workout. The main man himself was just sitting nearby, happy to watch until the floppy fish finally fell to the ground, creating a small cloud of dust that stuck to the boy's wet skin like paint. He chuckled as he rose, walking over to drop Midoriya's plastic bottle near his head. I think you got a knack for it. Having the breath knocked out of him was pretty normal for Midoriya at this point. It barely bothered him as he took a few seconds to rise off the ground. He only sipped the water, mostly using it like an ice pack to cool off despite the already cool training room. My main hobby's taking enough time already. Besides, all our work is about to pay off. I think I've got the drag lab on lock, so tomorrow night, you and me, some guards, and a whole lab of drags to wreck? Well, maybe your hobby ain't all sheet. You'd sure know how to plan a party. Mao nodded appreciatively, smirking, then helped Midoriya to his feet. Well, I've got all the time in the world, nothing to do tomorrow all day. Wanna gimme that address? Might check it out early. And blow the surprise? No way. The pair walked out of the firing range they used for training, Midoriya dusting off his legs and arms as they went. I kind of want this attack to work, Mao. Hey, you just don't want me getting all the glory. With a cheeky shrug, Mao led the way through the abandoned military base back above ground, and Midoriya followed the giant gangster as if it were completely natural. It was funny how the weirdest situation could become normal. Finding criminals, fighting them, finding Mao, training with him. It had morphed from a strange experience into Midoriya's routine. Sure, it was better on some days and worse on others, but that was just how it went. On the other hand, how the F are there so many criminals? Constantly? It felt like Midoriya had beat the shit out of half a city, and just focusing on the Yakuza, surely he was nearing 1,000 takedowns by now. Where the hell were criminal organizations getting all these people? Great questions Midoriya hoped to answer someday, but first, finishing training. The Vigilante's final training was the same as always, combat training. Trying to teach Kaminari and the rest of Exam F helped Midoriya sharpen his basics. Sparring against the Kendo Club developed his sword skills, especially with a handicap, and the streets were great practice just through sheer repetition. But none were as useful as facing Mao. The two fought for just 30 minutes, with Ronin cycling through most of his weapons as the two fought in the courtyard of the abandoned base. Hiding around buildings, using his guns to harass from a range, changing from guns to fire axe, launching blasts of fire while advancing into melee, then changing again from axe to electric spear to try and maintain distance. It wasn't just the best training because he could use all these options in one long, continuous fight. It was the best because Mao was a genuine threat who could actually beat Ronin, and even with all his options, it was Mao who tended to win these engagements. Being stuck against such overwhelming defense forced Ronin to see himself through more of his options to try and get solid hits, while still being threatened by heavy counterhits. He couldn't get comfortable, like when he tried just using the spear for a minute, banking on its long reach to keep him safe right until Mao tanked a spear hit, grabbed the spear, and pulled Ronin in for a nice big haymaker. This kind of combat training was very good for pushing Ronin to push himself as strong as he could. Even if it was a little too strong sometimes, like when Ronin used the lightning spear straight into the fire axe, finishing his combo by jumping off the main man's body and pulling out his 2 guns to shoot him 12 times. All just for Mao to barrel through and punch him into the ground because he jumped off the ground and had nowhere to dodge. A normal person probably couldn't barrel through that. Hell, Midoriya would be amazed if someone could stand after taking all that. So, the training wasn't perfect. At least he got to try some new tricks, ones that would be very helpful in the coming days, even if he wasn't thinking of using them himself in a real fight. Adjust your grip, are ya even trying? Mao towered over Midoriya as he pressed down, engaging with some wrestling basics. Yes, you're just one heavy motherf. Midoriya spat out between breaths as he was practically pinned standing up. Mao stood in front of him, the two grabbing each other, with Midoriya unable to stop the bigger man from effortlessly lifting him up just like Sato, one of the Exam F students. He had a problem where Sato could bowl through his defenses and overpower him, picking him up without actually improving in any way, something Midoriya wanted to fix. An opponent the same size as Sato or bigger, or even just one stronger than Sato, could easily thwart such a simple tactic. But Midoriya's 5 feet 7 inches but wasn't thwarting shit, especially against an opponent even bigger, heavier, and stronger than Sato. Midoriya had even put both legs against Mao's teeth, trying to push off, but he literally was getting nowhere. Unable to even move an inch away from Mao as the main man stood fast. He smacked Mao's hands with his own, and while Mao wasn't that excited, it seemed laughing at Midoriya's flailing and failing was good enough to keep him fine and dandy. Seriously, move, motherfucker. Midoriya strained his legs as strong as he could, but he couldn't get Mao to budge, leaving the main man standing as he held a squirming rat that was trying strong and failing harder. Don't just struggle, move against a Hans. Oh look, I think you're getting it. Yee, just keep moving to the left. Mao was smirking pretty strong as Midoriya tried to follow his advice, shimmying slightly. Really? Is this doing anything? Midoriya didn't feel any closer to getting out, and sure enough. Nope. Mao laughed harder, giving Midoriya a chance to escape as the big guy was distracted by his own laughter, slipping out as Mao's grip loosened and landing on his butt. Not exactly an escape strategy he could hope to emulate in a real fight or use against Sato. Look, you ain't gonna be good at everything. That's a fact. You need help with that shit, just get somebody else to do that shit. I hate it when you're right. Midoriya stood up, rubbing his sore butt in annoyance, both at the pain and the fact that he really couldn't learn a good method to do what he wanted on such short notice. He wanted to learn a good escape method he could practice on Sato, but in a real fight if he was grabbed he'd just stab whoever was dumb enough to grab him. That was a DMN good escape strategy, worked every time on the streets, but it wasn't the kind of thing he could safely practice with Sato. The two wrapped their training up with the real final part of training, stretching, aka actual torture, and then headed out to get something to eat. Midoriya had 3 more days to try training each of the students, and it was probably best to work on what he could do and then worry about what he couldn't. And what he could do was, after figuring out what everyone wanted to do, force them to do something else. So, today, we'll devote some of your time to movement, Midoriya told Exam F before they even started, meeting with all of them in the general gym to see all of them before they splintered off for self-study. The news was met with confusion and some groans, but Midoriya cared more about getting good results than being popular. One of the most important things about being a hero is getting to where someone needs a hero, and since none of you own a car, you're going to need to come up with your own forms of getting around. Midoriya had reflected on what he was going to try to teach everyone, and this was one of the plan points. He planned to do it on the last day, but since he needed a little more time to come up with better regiments for Sato and Kirishima as well as let Kaminari heal a bit more, he might as well do it early to stall for time. Now, this isn't the end-all be-all. But a hero with high mobility can get to disasters and crimes faster, save more people more quickly, and is generally better than the hero who's so slow they only show up once everything's over. In reflecting, Midoriya had thought over his own movement methods, both preemptive and in the moment. Preemptively, Midoriya tried to be in areas of crime to be as close as possible so he wouldn't need to travel far, cutting down travel time so he could arrive on the scene ASAP, but that would be something they'd learn when they started to learn about hero patrols and patrol routes. This was more similar to his parkour and previous usage of Yamato. Speaking of Yamato, you'll find that each of you might have different areas of movement you excel at, and I'd recommend you play into your strengths before trying to play against your weaknesses. He stared at Zero for that one, the hero student with tape powers who would be great in any area with tall buildings but terrible in any place with no structures for him to latch onto. It reminded him of Yamato. He had gotten so used to the sewers, a labyrinth of messy tunnels chaotically cutting into each other because Yamato allowed him to bypass the mess, meaning he could get places faster and lose anyone following him easily. Without Yamato, Ronin used the sewers much less. He couldn't see crimes as easily while traveling through, it wasn't direct, and it didn't play well with the climbing and parkour skills he'd been honing. This is the only day we'll be doing this, and you don't need to do it all day. But Midoriya locked his gaze onto each student at a time, turning his head so they could see and feel his focus on them even with the bandana over his eyes. I encourage each and every one of you think about how you move, how you fight, and how those two come together. Bakugo, you're with me. Kirishima, you're next, be ready. The rest of you, get thinking and get going. Dismissed. Bakugo's training went smoothly as always. The blonde bomber had an instinctive understanding with just a small lead. They started with a simple chase, to give Bakugo an idea of what Ronin was talking about, with Bakugo excelling in the outdoor area, but having more difficulty any time the quarters got tighter. He couldn't fly as strong and risk damaging the surroundings even if the villain damaged them already or risk causing a collapse, a mistake he made once and only once. With that sorted, Bakugo practiced switching from moving to fighting and back again, a great combo as flying with his explosions warmed up his hands, letting him create bigger explosions, and creating bigger explosions in fights in turn helped him to create bigger explosions while he was flying so he could move faster. Once again, he was everything Ronin could ask for. Kirishima was a little tougher, having always been bad at movement and mobility. He was stiff, pun partially intended, he didn't have the out-of-the-box thinking to majorly change his movement style. You'll never catch up if you're just going to take the obvious path, Ronin warned from atop a building with just one level, a mere 4 feet above Kirishima but unreachable as Kirishima couldn't copy his parkour moves. He jumped off the opposite wall, grabbed the ledge, and then pulled himself up, but Kirishima couldn't even copy the wall kick, let alone reach the ledge from the ground, his hand wildly scraping at the wall and leaving a nice scratch but no traction. I'm trying. Kirishima, to his credit, was trying. He kicked off the wall of the single-leveled building, but even with that, he couldn't reach the ledge. He tried to copy Ronin's wall kick again, but without a muscle bodysuit, magic gauntlets and boots, he couldn't even reach the other wall to kick between the two. Don't try copying me, you can't? Ronin was stopped patiently, not even trying to run as he thought through this problem. Kirishima's big problem all came back to one thing. He was as creative as a box of rocks. Mao might have been able to turn super durability into a weapon that he regularly used to beat Midoriya and the Yakuza's buttes anytime he fought them, but it was because he didn't just stand around and take punches. He was a good runner. He worked out. He had a motorcycle in case he was in a hurry. He learned martial arts, and even weaponized his enhanced body by attacking with his extremely durable limbs. With hands as tough as his punch was like getting hit with a hammer. On the other hand, Kirishima, well, he could walk toward danger at least. You need to think up an approach that fits you. It doesn't even have to be with your quirk. Just think of what you're good at, and try to apply it to this. I didn't practice running and jumping though. Kirishima grimaced as he looked up at what he thought might be his hardest and lamest challenge yet, a gap of just 4 feet, 9 feet if you counted the rest of the wall below it. Well, what have you been practicing every day? Getting Kirishima to start thinking outside the box would clearly be a challenge, And even trying to find a place to start was as strong a challenge for Ronin as getting up this ledge was for Kirishima. Taking hits, lifting weights, some endurance workouts. Kirishima counted it off on his fingers, giving Ronin not much to work with. Kirishima could break walls with his hands, showing that his hands were strong and he had good muscle. Was there any way to expand on that? Can you do a pull-up? Yeah. Can you grab the wall? With Kirishima giving him so little to work with, Revenant decided that perhaps he would have to have Kirishima copy him, partially at least. Under careful instruction, Kirishima put his hands against the wall, then grabbed the rough contours, his own strong skin getting some good traction against the wall until Kirishima tried to pull himself up on Revenant's direction, getting a small ways up until his weight pulled him too far away from the wall, making him lose grip. Second try, Kirishima did a little worse, trying to leap onto the wall and grab it there, his strong hands scraping and scratching the wall, but not getting a grip. You are allowed to damage the wall, Kirishima. Grab the wall, embed your hands, then go up and do it all over again. Revenant tried his best to walk Kirishima through it, and with proper guidance, he could see the results, metaphorically and literally as Kirishima slowly ascended the wall. To us. Progress. Even if Revenant had to think of it himself. He rubbed his head, sighing, then focused less on the problems and more on the work ahead. Good, Kirishima. 4 feet to climb and it took you. Midoriya checked his timer, doing some rough math. 40 seconds. I think we can get that time down, don't you? Kirishima was the hardest, pun once again intended, but it still wasn't easy past that. Siro and Mina both were good in the streets in fairly different ways, with large overhanging structures and sharp twisting paths respectively. Siro had trouble with empty spaces, anywhere he couldn't swing on a massive structure. Mina's movement depended drastically on the terrain, being great on most surfaces but coming to a crashing halt any time she met her old enemy. Sato was, luckily, a repeat case of Kirishima. Even if he couldn't dig his hands into the wall like Kirishima, his enhanced grip strength let him grab the wall without damaging it, and with his enhanced leg strength, he could even jump greater heights and run faster, meaning he was actually edging out in the mobility department, only slowed down by his own lack of skill at running, showing it wasn't something he regularly practiced. And of course, the last hurdle was Kaminari, better running than the rest because he had been forced to practice it, but without using his quirks still slower than Mina's slide, Bakugo's flying, or Siro's SW&G. Still, his well-developed basics gave him a great platform to build off of, and to return to a very old activity. Kaminari's brow was damp with sweat from effort and heat as his body sparked, concentrating very strong on his legs. Bits of electricity radiated out from his legs as he walked, using his quirk to move his legs at speeds much faster than normal, and a little faster than Kaminari could normally control. It was strong to just walk in a straight line without accidentally teetering off to one side. Keep correcting your gait, Kaminari. Don't focus on me, focus on the terrain. Look where you're going. Ronin oversaw Kaminari's training, standing atop a building to watch, far enough away to serve as a difficult goal Kaminari would have to try to reach, but close enough to intervene almost immediately if something went wrong. Walking in a straight line was something Kaminari had practiced tons before, he just wasn't that good at it still. If he had been good when he lost control over his emotions and rushed Ronin, he would have actually hit a couple of times instead of running straight past. So now, it wasn't a matter of doing it. Kaminari could cover his legs in electricity and do the super move with little effort, but he just couldn't actually aim it yet. So, Ronin took a trial-by-fire approach. Relatively. They stood in the movement training center because the ground and buildings were soft, meaning Kaminari could crash all he liked, but instead of just doing a straight line, Ronin threw out more complicated problems. Stairs to climb up, corners to round, things to jump over. He hoped that by forcing Kaminari to work on some more advanced moves, the blonde bolt's basics would improve even if calling turning and jumping advanced moves nearly made Midoriya facepalm, but it was what it was. As the day wound down, Kaminari had practiced almost every basic moving situation Ronin thought he'd realistically needed in, but even so, that wasn't enough, and so Ronin ended the day with a quick talk to all of Exam F one final time. Alright, I'll get out of your hair in a second, he said as he rounded them up from around Gym Gamma, where many of the students intended to spend some extra time to further their development. Even as he focused on Exam F, some of the other students turned their gaze toward him, listening in as he closed out the day's training. But first, feedback. Does anyone have any questions? Comments? Concerns? Climbing essays? If you say sugar addict? Spiky hair? Kirishima and Sato both lamented their training, focused on an entire area they hardly ever developed before, while Bakugo bit back to defend his hobby. Good to see that Bakugo was still into rock climbing. Midoriya guessed. Didn't really matter to him as the blonde bomber tiraded both of them, ready to show them what good climbing really looked like. Climbing? Nah, Kirishima. Mina shook her head at Kirishima and Sato as if she, the second dumbest in one, knew what was really going on. She stood side by side with Kaminari, the true dumbest in one, as they shook their heads and then gave a tired smile while speaking together. Stares as he. Well, everyone has their own problems, Ronin muttered mostly to himself as the students argued over who had it the worst, with Zero and Bakugo on the side making everything worse, one for his own enjoyment, and one because of his overwhelming passion and pride. But if you don't have anything else, you might have noticed you all experienced a variety of problems today, including some situations outside of your normal wheelhouse. Ronin paced slightly, looking at each of the students as he spoke to try and establish a firmer connection in their heads. Tight corridors, high obstacles, rough terrain, all of these things aren't what you should normally deal with in the field, and all of these things can be avoided if you carefully pick what kind of work you'll accept when you're a hero. Not everything you did today will apply to your hero career. There might even be some things that you might only have to face a few times in your life, and even then, you won't have to go through them. But the provisional license exam isn't something you'll experience often. Ronin stepped back, now talking to all of Exam F in a clear-cut loud voice, addressing all of them simultaneously to help them see the bigger problem. The provisional license exam isn't designed to work like a normal day of professional heroism. It's designed to push you to your limits, to put you through as tough a situation as possible. It generally combines combat and rescue elements into one space to push you to both extremes of heroism. Midoriya was unsure how many of the students studied past provisional license exams, but last year had a small army of robots posing as civilians and a barely smaller army of similar robots as terrorists, forcing the examinees to have to battle the terrorists while protecting the very similar-looking civilians, with the terrorists even deliberately being mixed in with the civilians. You might think you'll hardly ever use these movement skills, and you might be right, but the provisional license exam is designed to STMLT exactly that. The worst of the worst, the toughest days you'll face, and it's designed to bring out every single thing about you to show just how good of a hero you are. When the chips are down, that's why your combat must be top-notch, and why I want your movement to be up to scratch. Ronin wasn't sure they'd get what he was saying, but he had to make a point, so he had to bring up some tough times. If you want to be professional heroes, you'll need to be ready to deal with the next Hell Knight. The Kamino Ward incident, just its name made most of the students shiver at the memory, watching their idol All Might battle it out all over the news as monsters rose up from underground laboratories to wreak havoc on the city. It truly was an event that pushed every hero that was involved to their limits, and Ronin would know. Even his incredible pain tolerance got pushed to its limit when he nearly blacked out and died in a single hit from that weird female Nomo just seconds before the fight finished. So, whenever you think the training is tough, whenever you're pushed to your limits and can't go on, remember the threats you'll have to face. Ronin pulled them out of the memories of that night with his loud voice, even as a few couldn't help but turn and look at the diminished form of All Might as he stood a small ways away, watching them back in return. In fact, almost all of the students were at this point. It's better to find your limits here than in the field, so push strong. Give it your all. The provisional license exam is tough, but it's not impossible. It's designed to be beaten, and your trainings are designed to make sure you beat it. Now was the part Midoriya struggled with, the motivational stuff. A little unsure how to hype them up while keeping them cautious, Midoriya decided he'd lean more heavily on the warnings than the hype. Wasn't his thing anyway. That's why you need to train even the things you're bad at. Your movement skills, your close combat, your long-ranged combat. Hell, even your people skills. Communicating as a team can be crucial. We only have 2 more days together, so we'll push harder on pushing your limits. If anyone has something specific they want to work on, come see me when you get the chance. Ronin, or more accurately Midoriya, was a little upset. This was all he could do for them. Ironically, because UA was a good school, they didn't have the time he'd like to WHP them into shape. They had to study for exams, do homework, and actually try in class. Midoriya had been done with all his school work for the year for months, leaving him to spend his days as he pleased and work on himself as much as he'd like. But that wasn't something he could deal with. With that said, you all have been doing well. I've seen big improvements since the training camp, and I hope to see more in these last 2 days. Don't think I'll let you slack off because the end is approaching. Ronin couldn't miss as Exam FS expressions shifted from worry to determination, even smiling and sharing some jokes with each other. Not really his thing, but if they wanted to come together and work together, it'd probably be for the best. Keep thinking about how you want to improve the heroes you want to become and keep striving to become those heroes. Now, dismissed. Sir? Sensei? Dimen right teach? There was an air of excitement in Gym Gamma as the students decided that maybe they could stay just a bit longer, maybe train a bit harder, to their teacher's approval, like Midnight, who stepped out for 5 minutes to get some more drinks and had no idea why everyone was so excited but was happy to see it. Morale is up, the motivation is high, and the activity buzz is strong, a great atmosphere for a training gym. Ronin didn't stick around to see it. Today was a hunting day and he wanted to get to it. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder, making his way out until he bumped into his favorite principal, at least compared to Aldra's principal, the fluffy football himself. Ronin glanced back at the group one final time, shrugging. The motivation is, but will it be enough? I can't teach them enough to ensure it. Still, Ronin wished he was able to push Sato a little further in their wrestling. Push all of them, in fact. Ronin had a niche that he filled neatly, a small, high-speed opponent. His strength wasn't his main point, it was his speed, even if the bodysuit did put him into the upper limits of what a human could do and near the level of some weak strength-enhancing quirks. If he could find a big guy to help him, he could force them to develop in new ways against an opponent they realistically would have to face. Almost every Nomu Ronin had ever fought was more of a big strong than a small fast type, and even the fastest ones were well bigger than him. Just dealing with a heavy, strong, and large opponent could help them develop a lot. Maybe there was a teacher at UA he could use, or a robot. No, Vlad King was the teacher of 1B, so he'd be busy. All Might was all retired, Eraserhead was the same type as Ronin, Midnight was too niche, same for Present Mike. Maybe he could just do a big robot? Ugh, but then he'd need someone like Nizu there the whole time to operate the robot, and Nizu had a history of going a little too far like Kaminari and Mina's midterm exam. You've done fairly well with what you have, even if they won't have their ultimate moves. Principal Nizu gave him a cheeky smile, showing he didn't really care about the ultimate moves, just reminding Ronin that he couldn't teach everything. But I suppose if they really want those flashy moves, they'll have to develop them on their own. The gym's open all day, after all. There was Exam F. No, 1A's biggest weakness, their horrible self-study habits, or rather, lack of them. Only Bakugo was shown to train on his own, but he was always training, leaving no question of why he was the strongest. Ronin could only hope that his words would reach them and that they wouldn't just stick around the gym for a few minutes, but a few hours, putting in the time for some real development. Still dash. Nizu was quick to shut down Ronin before he could mourn his limits, shaking a finger at him. As a teacher, you have to know your limits, just like the students have to find theirs. There are some things that you can help them with, but there comes a point when they must trek on themselves. It was kind of similar to what Mao had told him, pointing out to the young Vigilante that of course he couldn't teach the kids everything, as even Ronin couldn't do everything. He didn't like it, but facts were facts. So, he'd have to work around them. Tomorrow you're planning for more combat training? Midoriya didn't fully understand why Nizu was wasting time asking about stuff like that. The pair had already gone over a rough idea of the plan for the week, but then again, Midoriya was wanting some help, so maybe the plan was changing a bit. The plan is still on track so far, but I want them to train against a variety of opponents. If this keeps up and they only fight me, they won't be prepared to fight tough challenges or face a variety of opponents. They'll just be prepared to fight self-destructive vigilantes with too many gimmicks? And you have someone in mind to help? Nizu spoke in a sing-songy voice, eager to lend you as aid if possible, of course. We do have many staff busy right now with many important tests right now in Class 1B, 2A, and 2B have their provisional 2 and 3A and 3B are setting up for internships and apprenticeships, but I'm sure one of the third-year teachers could spare a day if you asked. We'll see. Midoriya's tone was a little less hostile and a little more jovial as he made his small list of requests, both because he was getting to help and because he was getting to do something fun in his eyes in just a few hours. And if that's all impossible, I could probably do something with, hopefully, just one robot per student? Well, it shouldn't be impossible, but I guess only time will tell. Nizu smiled up at Midoriya as they reached the front gate, but he was determined to hell and back not to let it come to that final option. He wanted to see something fun. He'd seen thousands of those robots get smashed up, and he wanted something exciting. It was that longing for excitement that got in the way of his rational thinking, but as something had gotten in the way of him thinking rationally, he didn't notice. Then I'll see you tomorrow, same time as always. Midoriya exchanged polite partings, turning to leave through Yue's front entrance as he walked out slowly. Then slower, and Ronin? Ronin came to a gradual stop as his mind gradually sped up. He did have some plans, but we've helped each other out quite a few times, haven't we? We have. Nizu answered as slowly as Ronin spoke, his head ped as he tried to piece together what Ronin had planned. The noticeable change in Ronin's posture, the slight switch of tone, he was thinking something. I was wondering. Ronin glanced over his shoulder, his bag swaying slightly with the motion as he looked back at the furry effer for something he probably should have thought to do earlier. Off the record, do you know of any crimes going on? Anything that needs an extra hand? Now, Ronin just intended to maybe pick up a few hints towards a crime spree, or maybe some tips of where a villain or two was just to give him something to do. As he discussed with Mao, he already had plans that night, but those plans wouldn't last all night. Besides, Nizu was head of a hero school, with the former #1 hero on his payroll and every single one of his other teachers still being an active hero. Surely the rat dog raccoon BSRD had a few tips he might give out. Ha. Why are you laughing? It wasn't a coincidence that Revenant came out as if this was an actual crisis, as he realized asking the furry effer about this might have been a mistake. Sheet manual was good, ma man. Outside the golf course the two men met, Mao riding up on his chopper with a big smile and Midoriya relaxing in casual clothes. They'd SW'd into their uniforms somewhere along the way to be a little discreet, but first. Fighting's good, big man. Got so much coming in, you'd think it was a martial arts tournament. Midoriya responded to the big man's big greeting with a nod as he sat outside the minigolf building, sifting through the printed papers Nizu had lent him. They read some interesting things, especially if they were true, and why wouldn't they be? Turns out my teaching idea wasn't so stupid. Check this sheet out. Man, having other people do research for you feels great. Midoriya couldn't help smirking as he raised the papers up to show the main man. Under an hour ago, Midoriya had been teaching Class 1A, but as he left he caught Nizu. Instead of blowing the furball off like normal, he decided to do something he hadn't dared to try until today. He asked the furball about any ongoing big crimes. After all, if UA's principal trusted him with students, why wouldn't that principal trust him with a few crime reports? Mao took the top paper, checking it out, then took a second one, then flipped them over to see both papers had backs. Sheet. Sheet man, this is a floor plan and this sheet's detailed as sheet. You got stuff like this? Not unless I broke into City Archive. Midoriya tapped the papers against his leg, setting them all straight. The papers were the information they had so far on the Shy Hasakai, the same Yakuza Midoriya and Mao had been terrorizing. He heard we were terrorizing these guys and it turns out, there's an active investigation into them already. They already some information on them, and since I'm helping out the school. Sheet. You work in a good angle dear, Centipeder. It was strong to tell what impressed Mao so much. The big man was just looking at some floor plans. Midoriya figured they'd be useful for going in and clearing the place, maybe planning a route, but Mao put way more interest into them than Midoriya did. Was it a difference in experience? Huh, this ain't no warehouse I've ever seen though, lots o' rooms, all as small as y dash. This sheet ain't the place we sweep in tonight, is it? Nope. This is a future project, Midoriya said, skipping over Mao's interesting vocabulary as he gave the main man a few more papers, details on the place in question. Apparently, in a few weeks, the Hero Association is trying to smash the head of the Yakuza. Apparently, this is the head's place, an ancestral home, I think really old-fashioned. Don't know why they need so much time to arrest the head if they know where he is, but apparently, Nisa's willing to try and get me on the task force. I could ask about a +1 if you're interested. And work with heroes? I'm crazy, not stupid like your dumb butt. Mao got a chuckle out of the papers, but he passed them back. Just like Midoriya thought, the main man wasn't interested. I've got plenty of fun with my current gig. And speaking of which, get your GPS out? Midoriya passed Mao the saved coordinates, currently in active business, a shopping mall on the outskirts of town. It had been kind of fishy and on Midoriya's radar for a while. He raided so many places, but almost all had at least one receipt from this place. He only realized it by accident. He had a habit of grabbing important papers and taking pictures of them, leaving the physical copies for the police. During that, he started noticing this one food store had receipts in the background of almost every picture. There was a ton of them, across 7 dens, with some being over an hour from that store. Now, that alone wasn't concrete. Midoriya figured the store was just near the drag production place. Then he investigated the place himself, and after sitting on a rooftop for 3 hours, he saw something interesting, a DLVY driver with a broken arm. More specifically, it was interesting, 'cause he broke that guy's arm just days ago. He hadn't been able to bag him because that guy played dead, and while Ronin focused on other criminals, that guy slipped out. Midoriya wasn't sure why you'd have a guy with a broken arm to drive, that didn't feel safe, but it was another lead in a small stream that gave Midoriya a solid idea that this place was shady, especially when he used the internet to reach out to other vigilantes and get a few other opinions that gradually turned this crackpot theory into something concrete. It's not great, so we start casual, walk in through the back when we see a truck in, investigate the stuff, and if it's drags, boom. That's my plan. If sheet was Anna simpler, I would have thought it up myself. Ma laughed at the simplistic but ultimately reasonable approach. It wasn't like Midoriya had a huge force of investigators like the heroes, collecting building plans and even history on targets. He just spent a week poking around this place, ultimately coming to the conclusion that this seemed to be the distribution point for the drags to the warehouses, meaning either they were shipped from overseas to here, or there was a lab here. Speaking of labs, any idea what kind of kit we're dealing with? They've got guns, at least. Another big reason the store was suspicious. A few locals had seen workers with guns around this place. Not a lot, but getting guns in Japan legally was strong as F, and there was no way to justify having guns to guard some store's frozen vegetables. It was supposed to be a food store, not a jeweler, so what was so valuable that the workers would carry guns? I think it's supposed to be a secret. Locals don't see them much, but a few homeless people in the area have. Luckily, these guys are like the rest we've dealt with dash. They're dumber than me. Mao laughed as they rode his bike to a midpoint, stopping to SW's its uniforms and rides in an underpass. They switched from Mao's usual chopper to a bike Mao hid and chained in place in advance, hopping rides then drifting towards the mall. Dumb people are the most fun to fight, nothing's more dangerous than an idiot with a gun. Guess I beat in the lead. Didn't I beat you by shooting you? Proof of how dangerous idiots with guns are. That. Mao pulled up 2 blocks from the mall, riding into an alley and killing the engine. Long as I know what I'm getting into, I should be Gucci, fam, don't worry. Should. Midoriya had to take a few extra seconds to get everything off the bike and onto his person, ending by taking his helmet off and adjusting the wig underneath to at least try being a little stealthy. He rolled down his jacket's large sleeves, covering the metal gauntlets. He even brought the stupid umbrella attachment to cover his sword. It hardly did a thing, It was almost 100 degrees out, but no harm in trying. Mao's disguise was a lot more casual and therefore, better. He had already shapeshifted into his mock Midoriya with incredibly pale skin and still white hair. He wore his usual outfit of baggy briefs, some solid boots, and a new piece of equipment on his torso, still no shirt. He tucked his mask and kanabo pieces underneath his newest piece of equipment, a long-tailed vest, made of several pieces of eltar with spots to hold his mask, kanabo, and even some guns that were big and baggy even on the main mantum. You sure this vest is supposed to be this loose? You'll just ditch the vest when you get enough hype. It better be loose enough. How's it feel? After a long time of measuring, adjusting, and working, it was finished, the prototype of Mao's new vest. This one wasn't made out of metal muscle, but it did have some muscle included in the design. It was basically a long, sleeveless version of Midoriya's usual jacket, down to having a ton of pockets to hold things on the inside like Mao's mask. Mao worked his arms, checking the tail of the coat. He practiced by throwing out a few kicks, the coattails flowing a moment behind his legs as they were pulled along. Could be a little shorter. I'll make it work. The pair made their way out from under the little bridge, moving the motorcycle to one side, then kept walking towards their target, a bland-looking two-story building with pictures of food plastered on the front. It had metal shutters and bars over the windows. It fit in well between the rougher side of town it was close to while still remaining decent looking for the nicer area it stayed in. Around the back was the bay that trucks would pull into, with two big bay doors, and the ground sloping downwards so the back of the truck would line up with one of the bay doors, and a door into the building. There was already a truck pulled into one, so all we have to do is wait for another truck to pull in. My reports say it'll be here in an hour. The drivers aren't that consistent, but, hey, where are you going? Waitin', stupid. We're gonna do it kinda your way with these disguises, but I'ma do your way my way, Mao explained as he walked straight towards the back of the building with a shrug and a confident grin. Go in, find lab, beat the shit outta everyone. That doesn't make any sense, and do you think they'd be stupid enough to put their lab near an entrance? Toxin Lobseeders was. Well, that's why they're gone, we just need to wait for them to load a truck and oh god damn it. Midoriya realized that Mao's quirk must have made him immune to common sense, and unfortunately, it was probably better to try brute forcing his way in with Mao than to try his plan with Mao actively getting in the way, the nuances of working with someone who just wanted to fight. The two approached the back entrance, Midoriya keeping a careful eye out while Mao walked forward like he owned the place. Midoriya could make out no one in the truck, but there was a camera directly over one of the bay doors to look over almost all the area. If he had his preference, he would have moved in putting the truck between him and that camera to at least be more hidden, but with Mao walking in like he was $1,000,000, that felt a little pointless. It wasn't quiet, between the buzz of the AC unit mixing with the cicadas and a backdrop of wordless voices from the front of the store. It still felt weird to be so open about coming in, not Midoriya style at all, but step by step he caught up with Mao as they headed directly towards the back entrance like they belonged there. Climbing up the stairwell and walking in, the bay itself wasn't huge, a receiving area as big as the inside of a van, and then, rows of close shelving with boxes laying on and around them. There were things like packages of energy drinks, boxes of snacks, and other paraphernalia. Midoriya had to be careful as he stepped over some cheap toys that spilled out of a box, looking around for some actual people. He could make out a few through the aisles who were looking right back at him, some pointing at him and Mao. 2 came towards them, one went to the front. See any dintes? Mao flicked the vest coattails back to put his hands in his pockets as he kept walking forward, his eyes trailing up a random shelf and pushing it with an arm to watch it wobble. Besides the health code violations? Midoriya stared up at it too, shaking his head at the literally and metaphorically shaky shelving situation, then turned his head around to look for what he wanted, evidence of the Yakuza, specifically, the drags. The air was thick with skis from the front of the store, the boxes didn't seem to be in great shape, and the 2 employees were coming closer. Not at a glance. This is why I wanted to wait dash. Mao brushed him off, shoving a box aside with his foot as he walked towards the 2 employees and shot them a confident nod. Yo. Hey, this area is staff only. Get out. The employees looked gruff, like they could at least handle the boxes on their own. Looking them over for details, they both were pretty clean looking. Work gloves on hands, masks covering their mouths, some basic hygiene and safety stuff. Midoriya glanced towards Mao, who was already gearing up to punch the closest one, sighed, then started doing what was apparently becoming one of his talents. Bullshitting. He stepped up, putting a hand against Mao as if to hold him back and to signal who'd take this part. We're here for an inspection. The guys up high wanted to check in, so here we are. It was a weak story. He didn't even have a real reason, he'd just work on it as he went along. However, the two employees just stared at him for a moment, looking him dead in the eyes, or rather, looking directly at his bandana. Over his eyes, then whispered to one another as they turned slightly. One of them had a strange shape in the back of his waistband. A gun? You hear anything about this? Wouldn't be a surprise inspection if you did, Midoriya added, pushing forward with a backing of more bullshit. You need to be told to breathe too? Midoriya had no idea why his bullshit was working so well, but the two employees seemed to react better the more abrasive he was. Maybe it was the presence of Mao looming over everyone, maybe they just were new hires? Whatever was happening, it felt like Midoriya had set his expectations of this place way too high. This was breaking into a drag lab. This was the source for many of the takedowns Midoriya had been doing over the last month. This was... boss. The big man sent two guys over. Really? I thought the bullet was coming later. Midoriya wanted to punch Mao in the face for the cheesy expression the giant was making, as sure enough, they were led straight into the back of the store and over to one side. Right into what was obviously a drag lab. It was messy, with large plastic sheets over everything, what looked like chemistry equipment all over the place, an intense lack of cleaning and chemicals everywhere. Whether spilled on the floor, stained into the sheets, inside glass containers, or sitting in massive packs and barrels on the floor, this sheet was everywhere. There were more men inside the lab, wearing plastic bodysuits like you'd associate with hazmat or something, and everyone had masks. In fact, it wasn't until this exact moment that Midoriya started to catch on that this Yakuza might have had a mask theme, as even the ones not wearing breathing masks had something covering their mouths. So, you two were the one the bullet sent? Where are your effing masks? A smaller man who seemed to be the head of the operation shouted, unzipping his suit to expose a familiar handle, the grip of a gun. Both of them saw it, and with just one exchange, they nodded as they both reached for their masks. Thinking we're going to be walking around all over the place with them. How unprofessional. Seriously, ya muse, got a screw loose, cause ya leader ally, a skin for dis? The vibe of the entire room such as the two men put on their masks, each one reaching back to grab the employee who'd led them there and simultaneously beating them just as the drag makers started to panic. The man who'd been previously going for his gun reached into his suit, nearly dropping the gun because of his gloves, then drawing it and holding it up with both hands and pointing it towards the two sudden rushing forces coming for him. Oh, shit. It's them dash. Mao took care of his Yakuza by slamming him headfirst into the nearest wall, and when that little prick started to pull out his piece, he put the Yakuza between him and the heat, walking forward while laughing maniacally. The leader fumbled for his gun, drawing it just as Mao drew up on his block by coolly walking up before smashing the punk in his hands into the punk in his way. The two men crashed into each other, skulls cracking against one another before Mao punted them both down with a snap kick that sent both flying like ragdolls. Bang. Bang bang dash. Mao took a bullet to the mask, staggering for a moment before glancing at the punk who was firing at him, watching as the beach practically shat himself as Mao turned toward him and picked up a table, lifting it like a shield to block the next few bullets. The gunfire punched through the table but lost a lot of power, and between Mao's vest with the new metal and Mao's own hype, it wasn't even sheet man. The main man crossed the lab with his impromptu shield, pushing through and knocking aside the strewn about equipment and materials all his way to his latest target until close enough, then adjusting his grip on the shield before lobbing it as a makeshift projectile at where he thought the little beach was. The little beach in question dove out of the way behind more equipment, hiding between barrels and tables to dodge as he landed on his hands and knees. More men were starting to flood the scene, probably the security from up front. Mao glanced at them just to count before there was the click of a piece and some invisible force slammed into the newcomers, knocking them on their butts. There behind the newcomers, hiding in a corner like a little rat, was Ronin. The pair exchanged one nod as Mao grinned, throwing back the coattails of his vest and grabbing the 2 pieces of his kanabo, drawing them with a flourish before slamming both ends into his current prey. Ronin weaved around the injured Yakuza, the man who fumbled his gun and seemed to be the leader, keeping his eye on all the scene. Mao was wrecking house, but some people were trying to get away. Not on his watch. It only took a little repositioning to set himself between the mess of tables and the only exit, another example of a safety fail. Muramasa didn't even get drawn as Ronin took his stance slightly out of the way, then as 3 lab workers made their way to the door. Bam. Bubble. One stab to the inside of the leg, tripping the first. One got smacked in the city before a clawed hand pulled him in for a headbutt, then let him drop like a sack of rocks. The last one stumbled over the mess of limbs, too busy looking back at the monster that was Mao to see the flying sword until it struck him in the face, knocking him flat on his butt and out like a light. Midoriya only had a moment to look over his mess, stepping back into the shadows before suddenly more men came in from the other side of the doorway. They were entering the lab instead of trying to run, with weapons drawn. Was this the security? Needing a way to try and cause a lot of small damage fast, Ronin one-handed his sword and drew kindness and started prepping a charge shot, letting the men enter a small way in to ensure none escaped, then struck. Once all had passed the door frame, one began to raise his gun. Weren't guns supposed to be strong to get in Japan? To prove this point, Ronin raised his own custom gun and shot the charge shot straight into the men's legs from behind, a sudden sweeping force that knocked them into each other. He then closed in with his sword, smashing into them to fully knock them over. Then he took a step back, switching his gaze to Mao's opponent, and took a step back. Bang. Yiwa. Boom. Ronin and Mao briefly shot past each other as they such targets, with Ronin exchanging fire with the people still standing in the laboratory, his armor more than capable of taking a few bullets even as the concussive force of being shot rocked Ronin back slightly with every hit. In exchange, he fired back with his own concussive force, firing a barrage of air blasts to knock into the scientists. It wasn't foolproof. Some scientists started to figure out that they should brace into objects to avoid being knocked over, so Ronin got creative and started shooting all the junk around the room, like the lab equipment on top of the tables. That sheet went flying, crashing into people and breaking. It looked as painful as it sounded as glass vials shattered on impact, their shards blasted backward. And on the other side, with the signal from Ronin, Mao leapt across the room like a human cannonball, slamming the 2 halves of the kanabo together and twisting to lock them in, then pulled it back like a sledgehammer as he vaulted for the pile of bodies trying to untangle themselves. Bang. Ronin was quick to SWH targets, firing off at people behind Mao, so the main man could focus solely on hitting these punks so strong they became a permanent part of the floor. He couldn't help laughing as he planted his feet, turning all the momentum of his charge downward just as he reached the Yakuza's reinforcements before slamming the kanabo down into the pile with a loud boom. The quirk in the kanabo activated, sending out a shockwave of some kind as it impacted. With a major blow dealt, Mao moved the kanabo into the crowded dog pile, spearing a Yakuza off the top of the pile and into the air before turning around and hitting that motherfucker with a baseball swing, sending him right back where he came from, crashing into the storage room. He gave one final slam into the pile, then turned and gave a wide swing that nearly sent a lab guy who'd been trying to bail out a window bailing out of life if he didn't fall on his butt, screaming his head off as he covered his body with his arms, crossing them to protect himself, and forming a nice little target. X marks the spot. That motherfucker got a free flight, and he didn't even need tickets. The lucky BSTRD. Ronin kept firing at people, all the way using his parkour to get around the increasing mess of the lab as the ground became more glass than tile. He hopped a table, vaulting straight into a gunman and kicking him back, then shooting out one leg and slamming the falling man's head into a table and letting him slump down. He then turned, raising his gun to harass the next guy before Mao took a wide swing at him. The big guy had that guy covered, so Ronin moved on. He turned slightly, but in that slight pause, someone ran up and tackled the small vigilante, trying to lift him up. Even with his gear, he wasn't that heavy, And instead of his Beowulf boots locking onto the floor like Ronin wanted, they only picked up broken glass and tarp, letting Ronin get lifted like a sack of potatoes before being rammed into a wall with a solid thunk, giving way to a loud crash. The first thing Ronin noticed is that this helmet was way better than his last one. The back of his head felt fine even as he was turned into an impromptu battering ram, breaking a window as he was driven backward. He grabbed the windowsill to stop his backward momentum, dropping his sword for a second before lashing out with a knee into a kick and releasing the glass stuck to his boot. The man's grunt turned into a scream as first he was doubled over by a sudden knee, then a foot bringing sharp glass dug into his stomach. He slumped over, curled up, and Ronin made a note to get that guy immediate medical attention when this was over. With the fun slowing down, now Ronin could hear shouting from the front, and not a disciplined kind. It looks like either there was a mess happening up front on account of almost everyone being back here. Now, all of the employees had to know what was going on back here. This lab was way too obvious. That meant all employees were in on the gig, so that meant no one escaped. Ronin kicked his sword off the ground, grabbing it midair and putting it back on his hip. I'm going up front to deal with the rest. You've got it back here? Blah. Fair point. Ronin hopped over the pile of bodies at the entrance, moving through the storage area and clutter to reach the front area where there were a few employees, a few teenagers in sloppy uniform, a few adults with pieces, and past them, a small crowd of people. Now, as Ronin walked forward, most of the employees turned to look at who was coming out, as did the customers. Ronin's gaze flitted across all of them, lingering on the teenagers, some just a year or two older than him. Could he really try to beat all of them into SBMSN just for working in the same store as a drag lab? Bang, 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 bang. Ronin coldly flicked up both his guns as he took out everyone on his side of the store, then started to build up momentum before he hit the counter and flipped straight over it into the screaming crowd and firing his guns into the air. On the ground now. The panic and unspoken rules took almost everyone to the floor immediately, with everyone knowing it was better to comply than be shot. Even if his guns didn't fire real bullets, but they didn't have to know that. Using the terror of being a villain, taking over the scene was pretty easy. He went up to the front door and locked it, then put a few zip ties around the door holder, the thing usually at the top of doors that slow down how quickly they close and open. With those few zip ties, the door holder was stuck, and it wouldn't budge, a cheap and quick barricade. With the door dealt with, Ronin turned back, looking over the small mixed crowd. There was an ambience of fear in the air as people stared up at him, far different than what a hero would accrue, but he wasn't a hero. Not by a long shot. Don't resist, and we'll all make it out of here nice and safely, alright? It never occurred to Midoriya that as little as Ronin or Ken looked like a hero, they were practically a textbook villain, clearly muscular, an outfit that matched the shy Hasaikai fairly well, and a threatening air of menace and violence that was completely genuine. The semblance was especially strong when he leaned into it, like he was now, using that fear to take control over the situation and keep everyone settled. With that done, he moved back around to the back, slamming both of his guns into one of the employees' head as he tried to get up and then shooting him 6 times in the CT to make his point, then kicking him to one side. I'm done with my side, how are you doing back there? Just dash wham. About dash. Done sheet. Ronin walked to the storage section just as a man tried to run out, then took an entire chair to the back of the head and collapsed. Following the escapee and the chair, the main man lumbered out with a laugh, his massive kanabo resting against his shoulder. He looked perfect for a guy who needed to just be scary. Perfect timing. Head up front and beat the shit out of anyone who resists. Wait, employees only. If they're civilians, just knock 'em around a bit, alright? Fixing his phrasing, Ronin drew out more zip ties to begin getting everyone all wrapped up for when the cops arrived. I'll call the cops when I'm done, we seal the back door and run, then when the cops arrive we'll already be miles from this place. See, now that's a good plan. I like dat plan. Mao laughed as squeezed past Ronin, giving the vigilante a pat on the back before lumbering to the front. Alright, sheets, I want all phones in a pile. If I see anyone getting any ideas, I'ma smash your head open so we... Mao's voice got more and more distant with distance. For some reason, giving Ronin the clarity to wrap up people's arms behind them quickly. He flipped people onto their front, tying their arms behind their back and leaving them on the ground. There was only one in the storeroom, but... Beep. Hey, can't a brother get an open door in this pit? Jesus, like I gotta do everything. From outside came noises, a truck backing in, then a door slamming shut. It was the truck Ronin wanted to wait for. To us. For once. Well, what a nice surprise. Ronin geared into a hidden spot to not be immediately obvious as he readied a charge shot at the door, resting his arm on a box while crouching slightly. His breathing slowed as his focus grew, eyes squinted beneath his helmet, and as soon as he saw a body in his iron sights. This place is more of a mess than even my own house. Your lucky overhaul didn't want to check this place out, or he'd dash. Bang. FWK. FWK? Ronin's shot fired off in an instant as a figure entered his sights, and only after he fired did he take in the man's countenance. He was tall and lanky, but not as tall as Mao by a long shot. He wore an open fur vest, baggy breathes, a big bottle on his hip, a big gray mask, mostly smooth with two big eyes holes, covered by some sort of mesh, and shoulder-length dark hair. The main thing Ronin noticed wasn't what he wore, though, it was how this man moved. As soon as the man registered something was amiss, he seamlessly dropped to the floor, Ronin's charge shot going straight over them, and then did a two-handed push-up so strong he went right back to standing as if he never dodged, all while scanning the scene until locking masks against Ronin. It's like that, is it? Ronin pushed back from his starting position, giving up the cover for a better mobility position, gun still raised, while his opponent drew his bottle off his hip, flipping the thing before catching it by the neck as a flourish and resting it against his shoulder to square up. Ronin wasn't sure how this driver? Ronin wasn't sure how this DLVY driver had somehow dodged his ambush attack, but it was clear that whoever he was the best Yakuza in the building now. Luckily, he didn't run. But was this guy on the same level as the showman, that artsy prick who kicked Ronin's butt? Ronin looked over the man's confident but loose posture, now noting the nice mix of scars across his body, and even gun wounds. The way this guy looked him over, scanning all of him at once, then locked on the umbrella on Ronin's hip. This guy was good. And that probably meant, sheet. Somewhere between a squat and a stand, Ronin sized up the scene. He was in a small market shop on the far side of town, a front for a drag den for the Shu Isekai Yakuza, whatever the hell that name meant. All across the floor in the drag den were the Yakuza he and Mao had just beat the snot out of, and he was mostly finished tying up. The problem lay in two entirely different directions. In the front of the store, beyond Ronin, were at least a dozen civilians who'd just been shopping here cause it was, on the surface, a market. Sure, some might be here to buy some illegal drags and disperse them, but he had no idea who and couldn't prove it even if he did. Sure, he didn't really work on strong proof, but the idea was there. Mao was in there with the last of the store workers, forcing everyone down to the floor with hands behind their heads, acting like a professional villain taking charge of a scene, because Mao kind of was a professional villain, just with a little career change. The idea of posing as villains made perfect sense at the time. You're in your local market and some guy with a katana walks out the back, beating the snot out of the staff. What are you gonna do? Call the heroes? Doesn't matter if Ronin posed as a hero, people would still call the cops would call the heroes, and then this vigilantism scene gets a whole lot messy. Even messier than this sheety storeroom with junk scattered all over the floor. No, it was better to pose as villains and force everyone to the ground under the illusion of violence to make sure this was as clean as possible. Or at least, as clean as could be before this guy showed up. In the back of the store, before Ronin, was one weird butt punk. Wearing an open vest, baggy breathes, a mask and an apparent drinking problem was the guy, seeming almost just like the dozen or so other punks Ronin and Mao had just wiped out. But this guy? This guy was different. He was good, and he was well aware of it, having dodged Ronin's ambush with a goddamn gun. How many Yakuza could react when someone shoots at them from cover, dropping to the ground just as the shot flies over them then snapping back to a standing position? How many indeed? Ronin stared down the Yakuza, his fingers adjusting their grip on kindness. First the showman, then this guy. How many guys like this did the Yakuza have? Most heroes couldn't even beat guns. Hell, of the top 10, only 3 were bulletproof, and one of them was All Might. Was this why the Yakuza were so big? For once in his life, Ronin realized something. This fight might require a skill Ronin had never really used before, especially if there were more guys like the showman out there. He'd have to make small talk. God help him. Most people would be dead right now. How the hell did you dodge that? As he spoke, Ronin's hand held kindness steady. He moved his shoulder back to draw for his second gun. No, if this guy could dodge a surprise gunshot, even 2 guns spraying wouldn't work. I'm not most people, now am I? The man laughed, moving drunkenly as he popped the cap off his bottle with his teeth and put it to his mouth. But he never took his eyes off Ronin, his head tilted so he could still make eye contact. Was this a feigned opening? His posture was loose but confident. No, that was definitely a trap. God damn it, too many of you Yakuza are too good. Where the hell are they getting you? Moving his shoulders forward, Ronin's free hand flicked back his coattails. His hand snaked back to grab a piece of his quarterstaff. But as he stood, he slowly walked around the haphazard aisles of the storage area. This place was too messy and too cramped. He'd never swing his axe, and his spear might get stuck. In fact, was his sword even small enough to be used in this room? Sheet. The terrain was completely terrible. He needed to draw him into the lab to gain the advantage and free up his weapon choice. I crawled straight out of hell, brother. The man messily wiped his face, closing the bottle by ramming it into his mouth easily enough, then shifted, and it was strong to notice, but this guy was moving even easier across this mess than Ronin was. This guy had to be a high mobility type, right? God, he sure hoped so. He didn't want to even think of fighting a powerhouse this agile. And you're straight out of our nightmares, aren't you? Yakuza hunter? Oh no, Yakuza hunters in the other room, Midoriya said as he straightened, smiling and speaking pleasantly as he pointed a thumb toward the front of the store over his shoulder. Bang. As the man's head was naturally drawn with Midoriya's hand, Ronin fired a shot from the hip, a large blast missing by a mile as the man swerved between the metal aisles, then narrowly dodged the air knife Ronin had thrown as a follow-up as it twirled end over end, narrowly flicking between the shelving to nick his vest. Again the man dropped and rose to avoid the attack, but now he rose into a defensive posture, hunched to minimize his size. Ah, then you must be Ronin. Thought you were dead, the way you disappeared. In vigilantes, like flies. Your drags must be too good for me to stay away. Without the element of surprise, Ronin continued to attack, throwing knives and punctuating them with gunfire when he thought the Yakuza would dive down to avoid the knives. Unfortunately, before Ronin could counter the Yakuza's dodging technique, his counter was countered preemptively. That's so? No longer did the Yakuza dive to the floor, now weaving and rolling around the knives. His footwork and weaving body even allowed him to sidestep an air blast, the shot just throwing back his vest and air fancifully before he dove in with a smile, running down the aisle straight at him. We aim to please, brother. Tisk. Ronin then finally went double guns, drawing Cupid and blasting the entire aisle in one motion. The combined gunfire knocked the Yakuza back, forcing and then maintaining distance. This talking thing was harder than Ronin thought though. He couldn't concentrate. No wonder heroes were so bad at their job, they spent too much time quipping. And man, this drag thing's making bank. The built distance wouldn't last as the Yakuza stumbled back, then rolled with a shot. A blast hit him in the left shoulder and he let it spin him around on a dime, rolling behind a series of boxes then grabbing them and rushing straight at Ronin with his new shield. Overhaul put a bounty on your butt. Who thought I'd be the one to get that too? You haven't gotten it yet? Ronin fired repeatedly towards the man, and instead of sidestepping the charge, walked into it to plant his feet and then go into a spinning back kick, spearing the box and crushing it with overwhelming force, but instead of launching the man, all he did was launch the box as the man let go and neatly slid around it, moving into Ronin's space and finally closing the gap. Yet, the man smiled so big it was visible past his mask as he swayed around Ronin, the vigilante adjusting his guard as he turned, the Yakuza's arms neatly crossing over and around Ronin's to grab him by the face. The Yakuza's arm wrapped under Ronin's forearm, then over his bicep on the inside to grab Ronin's face while locking kindness in place. One gun was stuck and couldn't be fired in any direction actually useful. Ronin tried to adjust his free arm to point it at the Yakuza, but suddenly a leg snaked between his as the Yakuza leaned forward, slamming the back of Ronin's head into a metal shelf. His helmet rattled, his footing was lost, and Ronin's shot went wide. Ronin scrambled first to regain his footing, then to try again with his free arm to shoot this slimy Yakuza. Slimy didn't even cover it as the Yakuza did a little hop up, getting onto the counter and sliding his grip Ronin's arm all the way to his hand, then wrapping his legs around Ronin's body. This motherfucker just slammed Ronin into a shelf with a judo move. And wait, wasn't this an armbar? So ya ain't as dumb as you look? The man laughed, his entire body suddenly tensing with one fluid wave-like motion as he lurched back to dislocate Ronin's shoulder. But smarts won't save you now dash. No. See, there was a painful sound in Ronin's ears as his shoulder really did dislocate, but what the man was more confused by was why Ronin didn't drop the gun his injured arm was holding. The reason was simple, he couldn't. The Beowulf gauntlets were still on, pulling the gun to his palm even as pain racked Ronin's body and his hand muscles lost most of their strength, leaving him holding a gun pointed right at the Yakuza wrapped around his arm. Bang. Bang 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 dash. What do you know? Ronin finally got a clean shot in, the man going slack after an air blast hit him with the force of a baseball bat to the bottom of his chin. Ronin didn't take second chances as he tried his hand at quipping. Ronin dropped his second gun and grabbed his bad arm with his good one, firing shot after shot as he slowly pulled himself off the shelf and turned it into a vantage point to shoot more easily from, and God, every shot sent more force up his arm and into that dislocated shoulder. This hurt like a motherfucker. Looks like my smarts pulled through again. Ronin would blame his bad arm later, but because of his dislocated shoulder or the man's incredible reflexes, he did eat the shots. Just not in the way Ronin intended. Instead of hitting him flatly, the Yakuza angled his body, moving backward with the shots and keeping himself loose. The air blasts hit the Yakuza, but they just pushed him back heavily, causing his body to twist and turn but never causing serious harm until they had an entire aisle between them again. Sheet. The Yakuza moved sideways, breaking the distance and forcing Ronin to either keep trying to use two arms to shoot one gun or do something different. Ronin made his choice immediately, his good arm sliding up his bad one and gripping it tightly before he slammed into a shelf, pushing it back in place with a barely audible sound. Jesus, did pushing it back hurt. The movies made this look so DMN easy. Who the hell even are you? Ronin snarled with the pain, working his arm and slamming a clenched fist into a shelf, using the motion to work out the pain of fixing his shoulder. He kicked his second pistol off the floor, grabbing it midair then readjusting his grip to holster it. These guns weren't cutting it, so no point in two. Time to switch weapons. Maybe I should be asking that what the hell is with those moves? You a movie star? The Yakuza laughed at Ronin's showy moves, then weaved as a more precise and smaller air blast weaved between the aisles, hitting the Yakuza's arm but causing no damage as the Yakuza spun with it, dispersing the force harmlessly. Me though? I'm the guy who's gonna kick your butt dash. The man lunged forward as Ronin remembered a thing or two from his fight with the showman, having charged up a shot as the Yakuza spun and talked, then firing it straight into the side of the shelf. Produce and packaging exploded everywhere, and Ronin threw knives as fast as he could into the mess with his good arm, aiming to the wind as he just tried to get some numbers out. Then come get some, punk. The air was chock full of destroyed cardboard, dust, and a strangely sweet smell that slowly dispersed to reveal the scene. The Yakuza had finally taken a hit, a knife to the forearm and one to the jacket. Looked like the jacket stopped the knife, probably some reinforcements in there, but one good hit. Payback for the shoulder. But it didn't look like this would stop the Yakuza either. Sheet. Sheet. The man clenched his teeth as he looked at the knife, moving his arm slightly, then took a deep breath before grabbing it and getting shot square in the CC as he pulled it out, his attention slipped. Sheet dash. Tisk. That shot was supposed to hit this punk in the head. His aim was still bad, he should have used his good arm. Sheet. Ronin worked his arm again, drawing an air knife and deliberately closing the gap now, ready to tussle. The Yakuza could sense it too, stumbling back, and he was not ready for it. But the Yakuza glanced him over, a mix of confusion, horror, and intrigue across his posture and voice. "Who the F are you?" The Yakuza's nightmare, apparently. "Now, are you getting on the ground, or am I gonna beat you into it?" Ronin threw the Yakuza's earlier words back in his face, being unable to think of a better one-liner, and then settled on his old reliable violence. He stood, a little unsteadily for some reason. Maybe this new helmet wasn't as good as he thought, 'cause he felt off. Maybe getting thrown into that shelf did something? "That I'm one of the 8 precepts of death, you little sheet. Learn some respect." The Yakuza lurched forward, grabbing and lobbing a box off a shelf at Ronin's head. The Vigilante stepped towards the flying box, swatting it out of the air, then suddenly feeling something, a quirk effect. As Ronin tried to move forward, the ground itself shifted slightly. It was ever so slightly, but it was enough to knock aside his aim slightly. He was still swatting the box and moving towards the villain, but now he was off balance. What the hell was this? An earthquake quirk? The Yakuza's smugness was visible, clearly confident in his quirk, perhaps thinking that a quirk that could shift the ground would easily win the fight, and that was why he hadn't used it so far. He advanced, raising his bottle like a club to beat Ronin over the head, and then a metal claw lunged out as Ronin grabbed hold on the motherfucker in front of him, something between a stumble and a tackle as he body-checked the villain before firing the gun multiple times into his body. To say either one was in control as Ronin stumbled forward and sent both of them crashing into the main lobby of the store would be a lie. The Yakuza was lifted off his feet, caught off guard as he attempted to dodge the wild blow, until Beowulf pulled him right back in. Ronin was barely in control himself, forced to lean forward and keep moving to keep his balance. He used this as best as he could, pushing into his opponent, but he was not in control in any sense. The two slammed into the counter, then the Yakuza grabbed Ronin by his big coat and flipped both of them over the counter, switching positions. Ronin had gone from on top and on the attack to crashing into a rack of breaded goods, landing upside down and getting kicked in the head to be launched further down the aisle. It would have looked cool if the guy who kicked him didn't also promptly tumble, tripping over a piece of bread but staying on his feet. All around the two were the civilians, and standing near the front entrance, Mao, resting on his big club with an air of surprise that quickly turned to amusement. "You need some help, genius, or dash?" "I've got this," Revenant snarled as he stood up with some help from a nearby aisle. The strange wobbling of the ground was giving him a headache, and the world seemed to tilt slightly in front of his eyes. If he could rub them, he would, but he couldn't, so he just pushed through, uprighting himself and moving back to build distance while taking aim with his gun and firing 2 shots that seemed like they were just about to hit before the Yakuza easily swerved past them. "Where the hell ya shootin', dumbass?" "Shut it." The Yakuza had stopped talking now, making his what straight up to while Ronin missed a 3rd and 4th shot. What the F was his aim? Before Ronin could contemplate his string of misses, the Yakuza smashed the bottle into Ronin's gun, first knocking it down and out of the way, then deflecting off that to smash the bottle into Ronin's face. Ronin still was Ronin and had the decent sense to lean back, covering his face and blocking the shot with his free arm, then advanced back with a wide stance to adjust for the shaking, and suddenly one of his legs just went out from under him. What the F was happening? "Take this, you stupid villain." From behind Ronin, someone shouted that out, running forward and tackling the supposed villain by the leg. And by supposed villain, that of course meant Ronin. Ronin had the entire ride from a standing position to him face-planting into the ground to realize what happened before. With the civilians' help, the Yakuza jumped up and drop-kicked Ronin in the face as he was falling, breaking his nose as 2 boots crushed the mask against his face. Mao was laughing his butt off, but he'd seen enough. With confidence he flipped the kanabo to an actual usable position, preparing to beat the shit out of the Yakuza and whoever else got in his way when suddenly more people got in his way, namely, almost everyone, seeing it worked so well the first time. Mao got a kick out of it as a man stepped in his way, raising his fists before the main man reminded Ronin that Mao wasn't a vigilante, his arm lashing between the man's to grab him by his throat and lift him off the ground, sliding the big bat off his shoulder. Mao was about to send this man flying like a baseball, And Midoriya was pretty sure the end destination would be the hospital at best. Shite. No civvies. V-dash. For some reason, Ronin was breathing heavily, and the world was moving like it was water. What the F was happening? He was constantly missing, he couldn't balance, he felt hot. And his head was pounding. Revenant snarled as a civilian tried to grab him, pushing off the floor and throwing the civilian aside. Sheet. Smash and run. You ain't running nowhere, pal. The Yakuza was completely fine, working his body, then leaning forward as the crowd around started to move and cheered for him. This shouldn't have been surprising, and luckily it wasn't, but it was salt in the wound. Unfortunately, Ronin could still see as the Yakuza drew just a single knife, seeming totally fine with taking on the two of them even with the civilians. Or perhaps, because of the civilians. Midoriya didn't have to weigh up his options, he knew his limits. Even if he could keep fighting, the Yakuza's quirk was taking a toll on him, and he couldn't get a clean takedown. This wasn't about his own safety, he had the bodysuit. This was about civilians, and between himself being literally and figuratively off balance. With both the main man and the Yakuza not seeming to mind getting violent with civilians, there wasn't any way he could reasonably keep the civilians out of the way and win, especially while they were attacking him, like when tried to jump him from behind. We're leaving now. Midoriya shifted on the spot, grabbing the woman's arm as it wrapped over him and spinning around to toss her away harmlessly. At the very least, they did what they were supposed to, wreck the lab, beat the snot out of criminals, and now the heroes and police would be here any moment. Technically, this was exactly what Ronin wanted. A shame he just couldn't take the extra slice of the pie and beat this final Yakuza into the dirt. Plan Z. De fac is Plan Dash? The main man's question was answered before he could even finish as Ronin grabbed two things off his belt, dropping them and grabbing an aisle for support as the world seemed to shift again, then toppled a shelving unit between him and the Yakuza for cover. The cover didn't even slow down the acrobatic villain who neatly jumped over the shelf, putting him right in the air as the flashbang and smoke grenade went off nearly simultaneously. Ronin was already backing away towards a window, slamming an elbow into it and only being annoyed when it didn't break. He then leaned against it for support, stumbling towards the door and eating a punch to the body before countering with a shove as he made his way to the door, breaking the barricade Mao had made away and stumbling out. We got what we want now, bail. Bail, that means now, duh. It took a little coaxing to get Mao out, the big guy breaking a window and jumping out it like Midoriya tried to. He was still obviously smirking as he moved past Ronin, the pair moving in the direction of their escape. Until Mao started slowing down as Ronin kept stumbling, unable to lean on anything as he walked in the open. "The F you doin'?" Mao looked over him, unimpressed, but as the door was thrown open and civilians piled out, there wasn't much of a time for questions now. The main man was totally okay with throwing hands with these overzealous civvies a little longer, but it wasn't worth it. We won. Ronin stumbled, leaning against Mao and not even protesting when the main man picked him up and started running towards Mao's bike, their ticket out of there. We found the lab, ruined it, and exposed it. There's no way Shu Ice Guy can hide it, but there's no reason to be here when the cops show up, so we gotta run. Hopefully, the Yakuza realized it too. Any civilians injured are just going to bring more heat, so he should slip out quietly, probably pretending to chase us dash. I get it. Jesus, you talkative today. Mao shook his head as he put some effort in, jogging faster down the street. Some people were already starting to chase them, largely unaware of the situation they were leaving behind. Mao kept his mouth shut, since Midoriya seemed so eager to flap his gums, doing work as he ran past buildings and to the bike, dumping Midoriya off to one side as he settled into it, turned it on, caught Midoriya as the young vigilante nearly stumbled right past the bike, and dumped him unceremoniously on the seat behind himself before gunning it out of there. They only had to drive for a few minutes to completely evacuate the scene with Mao's opinion of speed limits, stopping off in a different section of the city to SWH costumes and start walking away. Mao opened up the garage door in the storage unit lent to him, leaving his motorcycle inside before suching his vest for a real shirt, ditching the mask and kanabo, and locking the place up. He had already started shape-shifting back to his usual appearance on the drive back, already gaining a few inches of height back and becoming harder to recognize by the minute. In about 20 more, there was no way anyone would reasonably mistake him for being at the scene of the crime with his very distinct appearance. Midoriya took a little longer than usual, still feeling the effects of the villain's quirk. The drive over had illuminated something fairly obvious that he should have thought up sooner, that Yakuza's quirk didn't move the ground, it was just moving him, or rather, the Yakuza's quirk wasn't affecting the entire floor of the building, it was just affecting Midoriya and he overthought it. For some reason, Midoriya's sense of balance was completely out of whack now. I think his quirk must have been some kind of poison, Midoriya muttered as he leaned against a wall, struggling with his shirt to get himself through all the holes. But I have no idea how I got hit by it. I don't think his attacks ever got through my armor, so he couldn't stab me. Could he? Midoriya gave himself a quick pat-over, then grabbed his head, being hit by another wave of nausea and leaning against the wall for support. I should have an anti-venom kit in my things. Sheet, I'm not sure how good it is against quirks. Can you grab it for me, Mao? Mao was unaffected save for his amusement at Midoriya's predicament, getting a chuckle before going over to Midoriya's bag, looking through it, and giving up. He brought the entire thing to Midoriya, content to let him do all the work. "There you go, Centipider. Who'da thunk you'd be so bad against? Of poison?" His expression shifting from amusement to confusion, Mao leaned forward a bit, smelling the air, then looking over Midoriya again. "I sendi breathe out. Look me in the eye." Midoriya's expression turned grave at Mao's confusing reaction. Was this poison famous or something? Maybe it was from the drag lab? Slightly spooked, Midoriya breathed out through his mouth, looking Mao in the eye as the main man grabbed his head and turned it slightly before stepping back and nodding. Is it that bad? "Afraid so," Mao said with a shrug, looking him over and thinking it over. "Truth is, Sendi, you're a lightweight. You're a lightweight. You're a lightweight? What? Senti, I'm afraid you got hit with some illegal sheet. This stuff's only legal in Germany, I tell ya." Mao nodded stoically, then leaned forward, his face breaking into a big grin as he couldn't contain the joke anymore. "You're drunk." "What?" Midoriya pet his head, even more confused. But sheet's illegal, man. I know you like it loud and rowdy, but you're too young. Man, imagine why your parents be thinking if they saw this sheet." Mao was trying strong not to laugh and failing horribly. "Guess, technically, you really were poisoned. Man, most people be paying to get this buzzed. How did you get sloshed this fast? Guess I ain't ever talking ya dumbass bar hoppin'. But I haven't had any." If there was any alcohol in Midoriya's system, it was certainly slowing him down as he got stuck on the fact that he hadn't drank anything alcoholic. His mom didn't drink much, only when his dad came home, but even still, all he had was his usual energy drinks. Did the Gatorade betray me? PFT. Mao fully laughed now, slapping his knee before standing up as Midoriya focused on the entirely wrong thing. "Yakuza guy, quirk, proline made you drunk. Remember? Shish, you fall apart fast. Guess it's 'cause you're so small, shrimp?" Midoriya nodded slowly, trying to put it together bit by bit. The Yakuza guy had a quirk that made Midoriya drunk. Yeah, that made some sense. The Yakuza had carried a bottle as a weapon, and even drank a ton from it at the start. So, his quirk could spread out whatever was wrong with him to other people maybe? Like, if the Yakuza got poisoned, he could make other people poisoned? But how did he do it? Line of sight? The bodysuit and helmet blocked off Ronin's entire body. Once again, the bodysuit and helmet should block that. The quirk should not work by proximity, otherwise, the effect would have probably ended as Midoriya moved away from the Yakuza. It had to get to him somehow, but Revenant could not figure out how. All of his skin was protected, both his and the Yakuza's eyes were blocked by their own respective masks, so it could not be eye contact or subliminal, especially when Mao had figured it out by smelling the air, implying there was alcohol in Revenant's body, enough to smell it in his breath. Midoriya paused, rubbing his head as he worked out the headache, then moved over to the culprit, the gap in his defenses. He picked up his new mask, disassembled it into 3 pieces, and grabbed specifically the mouthpiece. Ronin's mask had a specific mouthguard function, a gas mask/breathing piece combo originally meant for underwater use with 5 minutes of pre-stored air and a regulator to clean the air he breathed in. Except, that was in his old mask, the one he stole from UA. Although he never used the pre-stored air cartridges, he had gotten so used to the gas mask portion that he had forgotten all about it, and never thought to ask about getting it for his new mask. Sheet. Midoriya pursed his lips, thinking it over, and chuckled. That I got drunk. I lost that fight because I got drunk. On the job. Was slacker ya are. Dupft. Midoriya couldn't help but laugh even if he was annoyed, shaking his head before rising off the floor and using the wall for support. I'm not even in the workforce yet and I'm already a terrible worker. That takes effort. Guess I can't go home yet, though. Don't suppose you know any ways to get rid of. What is this, a hangover? Oh, you think this sheet's a hangover? Ha! Mao laughed, giving Midoriya a pat on the back as they walked out of the storage area towards their usual meet-up spot, a certain mini-golf course, where Midoriya figured he was about to kill a lot of time. Ironic, it was so easy to hide bruises with all his years of practice from long sleeves to makeup, but this was an entirely new beast. His mom and his dad would have his, but if they even thought for a moment he'd been drinking alcohol unsupervised. Punk, in for a fun time. I wanna try doing some acrobatics? Just do a handstand for me, real quick dash. Man, off. Midoriya shook his head, working a hand through his hair as he moved beside the main man, trying to slowly regain his bearings. All in all, great night. Raided one of Shu Ice Guy's drag labs, leaving them no time to hide the evidence, and left something like a dozen criminals zip-tied on the floor. Met one of the 8 precepts of death, which sounded vaguely familiar, and got some good info on his quirk. Escaped cleanly. Nobody got hurt. The Yakuza sounded way too important to be dumb enough to try attacking civilians instead of doing the smart thing and running away too, so even if they didn't bag him, they completely ruined the Yakuza's plans. A great night indeed. And now, to make his night perfect, all he had to do was work off this buzz and make it home without being caught by his mom for something that only worried him a bit he might not be able to conceal, and the lecture he might get that he feared a lot more than meeting another one of those 8 precepts of death, like the physical manifestation of day drinking, or whoever that guy was. Being drunk was a strange thing. New experiences were always strange, trying to figure out how this new thing compared to things you'd done before, what you've done and experienced. At the moment, Midoriya's best comparison is that getting drunk is like getting sick. Why would anyone do this to themselves? His limbs felt strange, his head was pounding, and there was an uncomfortable warmth in his He was basically asking to be ambushed and get his butt kicked. There were also the more specific problems. His sense of pain had been dulled, further than usual if that was possible, and he had already completely forgotten that his nose was broken. If it hadn't been for Mao catching him before they split ways, resetting it would have completely slipped Midoriya's mind. Luckily, they had a few hours together bonding over both of them being dog shit at minigolf before they parted ways. It was a weird walk home, slowly coming off the buzz in the darkness, with aches slowly returning bit by bit. His shoulder flared up, seemingly at random until he remembered it had just been dislocated. His neck too, reminding him that he had gotten slammed face-first into a shelf. These were all the minor details that slightly blurred together, especially on very action-packed nights like tonight. Midoriya stood outside his door a moment extra. He didn't need a slap in the face to wake him up. No, the aggravation of the minor injuries that went through his bodysuit and his own poor defenses did that plenty. He gave himself a quick grooming, making sure he looked all right, then tried to open his neighbor's door 3 times before realizing his mistake and switching to the right door. I'm home. Midoriya smiled as he walked in, trying to be as presentable as possible. Stealth was an option, but Midoriya thought that taking it head-on was the best course. There'd be questions if he was caught, his mom would be on guard and might notice the alcoholic smell that stuck to literally everything that had been in that DMN warehouse. With his game being literally and metaphorically thrown off by the booze, it was best not to try it. But Midoriya could never quite remember his own rocky relationship with plans. Izuku, you're early. Inko Midoriya greeted Izuku with a smile as he stumbled in, more nerves than booze at this point as he fumbled with his shoes and tuned out. Good day? Aha, yeah, real good. Spent some time with a friend after school, hit the city, good time all around, Izuku said, giving his mom his best reassuring smile while trying to take his shoelaces on one-handed. In the end, he had to admit defeat and drop his bag to free up both hands while he undid the messy knot he made. Oh, that sounds like fun. Was it that Aiko girl from your class? She seemed a little intense. Inko muttered more to herself, unaware how off she was but how on she was about the real Voorhees Izuku had been spending time with. You can bring her over again sometime if you'd like. Tomorrow, we're going to have some company over. Maybe you could bring Aiko and her parents. Not tomorrow. Mitsuki hardly needs more people to get her riled up, and Katsuki dash. Yeah, I'll talk to her about it, Izuku said dismissively, the long sentences going long and far over his head as he finally got his shoes untied. But more importantly, dinner tonight. You need any help, Mom? Ah, so thoughtful. Inko gave Izuku a grateful smile, directing him further in and towards the kitchen. Most of the food is done. If you could set out the rice and plates while I finish up, that'd be lovely. Say, did you get something on your shirt? Yeah, someone spilled their drink on me while we were out. Hey, let me get those cups. And so, Izuku swiftly brushed past the alcoholic smell while also brushing past his own realization of his impending misfortune, as he usually did. Thursday's training went roughly on schedule, lining up well with the bare semblance of a plan Midoriya laid out. The young teacher wondered if there was a ratio of how much plan to how much ad-lib he should do to keep his plans from going to complete sheet, or if it was just dumb luck that the training was going so well so far. Perhaps it was because everything went horribly wrong in the first day? From the top, Bakugo was in high spirits. The training Bakugo needed was fine-tuning, working on what he had, putting it through its paces, and trying it out in practice. This also happened to be the exact thing he was doing yesterday, and this was a running theme for almost all of the students. The general vibe was just yesterday, but more as each student continued and pushed forward in their training. From Mina and Siro practicing in the movement area to Bakugo and Sato locking in within the concrete city, it felt like everyone had a good idea of what they wanted to do, even the students who weren't in Exam F. Next, Midoriya nodded as he walked back into the gym, his eyes moving leftward from the entrance as he took the entire place in, searching for one person in particular, not Bakugo up high, seeming to mutter about some distraction after school, not Kirishima down low, talking with Cementos and still trying to find a direction, but, Kaminari. It's your turn. Come when you're ready. Midoriya could hardly get the words out of his mouth before Kaminari ran across the space. The blonde blur's quirk quarantine was over, and he was more excited to get back to training, overtaking and greeting his temporary teacher with a big grin and even bigger motions. Keeping his own motions smaller but slowly ramping up to match his excited student, Midoriya led Kaminari across the way from one gym to another, the pair going over Kaminari's routine throughout the day, gradually zeroing in on what the aspiring hero wanted to do. There's a lot of options ahead of you. Sword practice, quirk practice, acrobatics practice, and more, so many combinations. Kaminari seemed as unfocused as his future with so many options ahead of himself. He'd spent the day so far practicing his quirk use, using his quirk on his legs and walking around the gym, and yesterday he'd spent almost all his time doing basic sword practice and some light sparring. Now though, it was time for a little direction. Remember, this isn't for the rest of your life. This training is just for the provisional license exam. Midoriya reminded as gently as he could as they entered the concrete city, trying to put some framework. You only need to pick a direction to train in. What skills do you think will be the most useful for the exam? Kaminari's mouth drew into a thin line that got wider and wider as he stared off, thinking this way and that as his head bobbed one way then another. I dunno. What's on the exam? What's on? Midoriya stopped in the spot, head tilting slightly, then thought it over and nodded a bit himself. Well, that's a good question. So good, I think I'll go over it again tomorrow because I think everyone needs to hear that, but specifically, no one outside the association knows. They have about 7 exams, and they SWCH around which one they do every year. One time, I think they did the same exam 3 times in a row just to mess with everyone. I'd recommend studying the past ones, just for your own sake. Rambling on, Midoriya decided the spot he stopped in was as good as any to drop his things as he talked. And the one in 223.7? That sounds right, 2237, summertime, AAA site? There was a heroine with a quirk very similar to yours, I believe. Definitely one to review. Yeah, I think that's the one my mom was in when she was in hero school. She's a pro hero now. Man, I can't believe she never told me there was another girl with an electric quirk in the same test as her. Kaminari, that probably was her. Oh shit, you right? With a smirk and a shake of the head, Midoriya tried to pull Kaminari back into the moment and pull himself out of his rambling. Alright, but what matters is some rough basics. Every exam has two things, saving civilians and combat. Generally, you just have to be good at one and alright at the other. Which one do you want to focus on? Saving people? Kaminari had a quick response, already doing some excited karate chops that seemed more like combat than saving people. It seemed like saying saving people was more what people defaulted to than actually meant. Revenant would not be surprised if even he said it if pushed. But perhaps that was his nihilistic side projecting. Alright, that's good. So, what will you focus on to help save people? And there you had it. You can. Think of ways you'll rescue people, go over safety protocols, might do that tomorrow, try to make yourself more safe and comfortable to be around. Midoriya tried spitting out a few ideas that popped into his head, with the last one catching Kaminari's attention. Looking safe? Comfortable? That helps save people? Thinking over the victims he saw on the street, stumbling back from him after he beat their attackers into the dirt, their expressions of horror and fear as he loomed over them, well, it can help. Just something to think about? I'm thinking improving at combat might be easier. You're thinking right, I'm afraid. Midoriya was actually a little grateful. He was pretty sure he himself needed more help with the saving civilians thing than Kaminari did. What about combat do you want to improve the most? What part of your combat do you think can carry you through this exam? There were a lot more interesting expressions as Kaminari thought through this problem. His quirk that he'd all his life thinking about and building up versus the sheer practicality and simplicity of using his weapon. One was something Kaminari likely spent his entire childhood building up, being able to use his quirk as a hero, but the other was far easier and more practical even if Kaminari had less practice with it. Midoriya had his own answer, if he was in Kaminari's shoes, but I think I want to work on combining them. Kaminari nodded along as the words came out, seeming to feel it out as much as he thought it out. I'm getting better with my quirk at lower voltages, I think I'm getting this sword stuff. I want to try doing a bit of this and a bit of that, you dig? A bit of quirk and a bit of weapon. If that wasn't a summary of possessed items, Midoriya didn't know what was. He got a little chuckle as he picked up his newest shurnai made just this morning for this very thing. Oh, sorry, but first, a bit of trial and a bit of error. Walk to that post and back while using your quirk. Come on. We've got a lot of training ahead. Closing out the day, all the students gathered up with the ringing of the bell to either leave and go home or to stay and go back to training. Before Exam F split, though, their teacher figured they'd share a few words. Exam F, gather up. Few words before we close out, shouldn't be long. 2 minutes, tops. A thoroughly whacked but unfazed Ronin stood before his students, looking over them proudly, the exhausted yet invigorated faces of his students who couldn't keep up with the small yet seemingly boundless energy of their teacher, who'd been more than happy to keep up with all of them throughout every step of their training. Seeing their attention, the old man smiled with some of that endless energy, nodding at each then going straight in. Tomorrow is the last day of training, so we'll try to do something special before the exam. Now, from what I know, the exam has 2 big criteria each year, combat and rescue. I'm not good at rescue, I can't teach you that, but we will go over the basics tomorrow as a final refresher. He tried to get a small moment with each, locking eyes with one student at a time, but the BLNDFLD over his eyes made it much more difficult. Secondly, ultimate moves. You all should have been exploring them out, and if you have any questions about them, I must again admit I'm not the best expert. That would be the other teachers here at UA, who are here to help you. Ronin went for the openness angle wholeheartedly, gesturing to the other teachers around the room. He was trying to take honesty to heart, and practicing it as much as he could felt like a good start. Lastly, I cannot tell you what will be on the exam. I myself do not know. I do know it is designed to beat most students who take it, so to oversimplify it, you just have to better than most. For some realistic advice you can use, think before you act, try your best, and trust yourselves. UA hasn't spent half a year training you to fail. It wasn't much, not even a minute. Ronin could also see not everyone got it. Went in one ear and out the other for most, but hey, at least he tried. With that little thing sorted, the students and the teachers headed their separate ways. Bakugo would usually stay back to train, but he was one of the first to leave, leading the pack of Exam F. Most went with him, save for Siro who wanted to practice this dive move, and Kaminari who was still trying to really combine his quirk use, leg motions, and some swordplay. Having just spent hours here trying to help, Midoriya figured it was time to let them cook and make himself scarce. He'd done his time. He gave Cementos a small acknowledgement before leaving the supervising teacher and Gym Gamma behind. He had to share a bus ride with the students of 1A, which was pretty weird especially when he sat in the very front near the other teachers who were leaving. He got to take a minute to sit in on Class 1A and their teachers, watching some of the dynamics and shenanigans completely unrelated to their profession for a bit. It was cool, he thought, to see All Might and Eraserhead chatting to one another, while the future professional heroes got to relax behind them. Reminded him of the UA summer camp before everything. Went to Sheet. From you, it was a bit of a walk to the usual putt-putt spot, but pulling up just as Midoriya arrived and then acting like he'd been waiting for hours was the main man himself. The big guy couldn't help throwing some shots at the young alcoholic, wondering if they were going to go on a bar crawl once they were done, but the ribbing didn't last long. It felt like a miracle some police weren't stationed along the way between the putt-putt course and Mao's hideout, with how often they went along the same route doubling the speed limit. Somehow, though, no officers were waiting along the route to pull in the speedsters, and they pulled off the road and into the woods safely one more time. After passing through the front gate and heading in, they got straight to training. Mao threw some shade at Midoriya, noting that young Vigilante's ability to fight was drastically disconnected from his ability to talk, even further than even Midoriya thought. Talkin' and trashin' ain't too strong ta do at the same time dog. Mao laughed as Midoriya went through his usual warm-ups, a jog around the shooting range before stopping to do way too many push-ups. You just think too much? Or maybe I breathe from the same spot I talk dash? Midoriya puffed as he started his second lap. This kind of talk on a man who could probably hold his breath indefinitely was wasted, but it was interesting to think about. Was the reason he lost against that alcoholic Yakuza because he tried to talk too much? Well, it certainly could have been a factor. Or maybe just 'cause you don't practice? Mao kept up with the Vigilante easily, talking all the while. Either his hype let him store energy without needing to constantly breathe, or he was really good at this, 'cause he seemed to talk as naturally as ever. When you fight, you always shut the F up. No banter, no witty remarks. I don't think I've ever you say something witty, Purity. Dear we do, that's the sheet. Mao laughed loudly, giving Midoriya a slap on the back that pushed him forward a few stumbling steps before the Vigilante regained his balance. Besides, talking, at least distractions. Midoriya tried his best to talk and run, but it was harder than he thought. As payback, he waited until Mao caught up to once again and jutted out his leg in a low kick, sweeping Mao's foot mid-stride and toppling the giant. One of us has to look professional. Mao took the trip in stride, stumbling himself for a few steps before catching himself with his hand and pushing off the ground, catching up easily. You look and sound professional as sheet, if professional means boring. Can't you get some color in your outfit? You try designing this sheet. Midoriya took a big gulp of air, trying to push himself harder for the final leg of it. Mao just laughed as he in turn upped his effort, chasing right after the Vigilante to pay him back. The training and sparring were nothing worth writing home about, just standard practice after a relatively standard day. The conversation was a bit more interesting, though. So, tomorrow, Mao started as he pulled himself out of the chain-link fence, stretching and pulling his clothes free of snags. Tomorrow, Ronin repeated, hands on knees and breathing heavily even with the suit. It was definitely true, talking while fighting was way harder than he thought. No wonder heroes always looked like dipshits who'd want to waste their time talking in a fight. You want me? Mao checked his digs, then looked down at Ronin, a mix of perplexed and amused. To come to UA, the hero capital of Musufuda Musudafu. Come to Mustard Tofu FU, and help teach a bunch of little sheets? Mao sized Ronin up like he was crazy, a truly absurd idea with no founding. Yes. No. F-. Mao snorted, shaking his head. Man, you musta hit ya head too many times. A villain head in there? I think ya stupid enough as is, now ya skin me ta tag along? You'd be a vigilante heading in, Ronin started. Still illegal. Still illegal, Ronin agreed, nodding. This was true. But you would have been invited. Vigilantes have been invited before, for example. Ronin gestured to himself while Mao laughed again, not buying it, but Ronin wasn't done selling it. All I need you to do is beat the shit out of some kids. It'll be like a day in the park. We go in, you fight 3 or 4 kids, then we bounce and go hit the streets. If you tries any shit, I'll be there right with you to kick their butts. Yeah, the drunks got my back, luck a me. Mao shook his head in amazement, starting to pick up his things. You know, dat sheet might be comforting if you still had dat stupid but magic sword. Dat thin was broken as sheet. Whata F you do with it? It exploded, remember dash? Don give a sheet. I know ya still have it, I was in charge on givin' that sheet back ta ya. Wah, does half a sword onla make half a portal? The F dash? Just reuse or reforge or re-something to DMN thing. First off, I still have a stupid but magic sword. Muramasa. Ronin defended himself as lamely as possible, barely getting the main man to raise a single eyebrow. Secondly, yes, I still have Yamato parts, but it's bent and broken and dash. And so what? Fix the Demon Thinman. It's a magic effin' sword. Mao shook his head, focusing on the issue as he saw it. Explaining it was going to be a little strong, so Ronin tried to organize his thoughts. Let's go on a quick detour, just for a minute. Ronin joined Mao, rummaging through his bag of spare things to pull out Cupid. He took a few steps back, picking the wall of a nearby shed as his target, then lined it up. He raised both hands, steadied his shoulders, held his breath and fired once, still going left of where he was aiming, but even he couldn't miss the broadside of a barn. There was a quiet bang as a blast of air was fired out, completely unnoticeable until it impacted the wall not even a second later. He glanced over at Mao, gesturing. See that? Yashidi form or Yashidi gun. Revolvers are cooler. Yeah, perfect. His point made, Ronin pressed on. Ronin set down Cupid and pulled out Muramasa still sheathed, then attached it to his hip. He lined up the shot, adjusted his stance, then slid a magazine into the gun sheath before dropping low and preparing. With a loud bang, the gun sheath fired, launching his sword out with explosive results. This was a technique that had barely rusted with time, and in fact, was more useful with Muramasa than it had been with Yamato, instantly giving the sword enough energy to use its own quirk, launching a red blade of energized wind to impact the side of the shed. Ronin spun his sword flashily before sheathing it, then turned to Mao. Alright, how about that? Did you see that? Your sword can shoot lasers. Whatever. Other one was cooler, 'cause dat one actually cut sheet. Mao did at least notice Ronin's point, even if he didn't pick up on it, so Ronin decided now was a perfect opportunity to explain it a little more. Yeah, but you saw the energy attack. Ronin began untying the sheath off his hip as he went over the details. The guns and Muramasa used the same quirk from the same original chunk of metal. In theory, they should work the exact same way. They shoot. I get it. Buet, Ronin tried leading him on, but when Mao wasn't biting, he held up Cupid and fired again. Again, a crisp trigger pull, a quiet bang, and a sudden impact as the energized air hit the wall. You can't see the gunshots dash. But could. Mao pointed at Ronin, then at the sword, then at the gun in Ronin's hand. But I can see the sword things. Exactly. Ronin pointed at Mao, nodding along, and explained what he thought happened. You see, Kindness and Cupid were made in one take. I made them straight out of possessed material. Muramasa was made as a byproduct of like 3 things. First it was possessed material, then I forged it into the AEC, then I cut down the material in the AEC and made a shotgun, then I reforged the shotgun and spare material from kindness and Cupid to make Muramasa. And somewhere along the way, Ronin trailed off, gesturing towards Muramasa. The quirk had a slight mutation. It weakened. Now, it wastes some of the energy, turns it into visible light. Honestly, after 3 reforgings, that isn't terrible. Maybe I got lucky that the mutation is so weak. But Yamato is a little more complicated than Muramasa. Muramasa has an energy-resistant quirk, which might be why is mutated so little. Yamato, on the other hand, got caught in a point-blank explosion and forcible quirk activation that destroyed a small mountain. Mao nodded, understanding the scene a little better now. That is kind of sheet? It's really sheet. Ronin wholeheartedly agreed. I don't even want to touch Yamato until I get a chance to study this, but with all for one gone, I can't get more items to test. I don't know if it's just temperature, if it's intensity, if it's time, or FANG whatever. I don't have the spare items to waste FNG around testing this. My plan, though, is pretty simple. Ronin opened a Gatorade, leaning against the wall next to Mao. Before I finished up with all for one, I got a few more possessed materials for future items. I've got stuff I want to make with all of them. But in theory, I can just sacrifice a few for experimenting, and once I'm confident and I've got all of the Yamato pieces, I'll try to reforge Yamato, if I think it's possible. Do you think it's possible? Oh, totally, once I understand what's causing the mutation. Ronin nodded, generally optimistic about the prospects. Once I find the cause, I can work deliberately to avoid it. If it's the temperature going to high, that's fine. I did a pretty bad job managing temperature when I made the AEC, the shotgun, and Muramasa. I just need to lock in, tighten the range, and not do it with so much variance by taking my time. If it's how long it's superheated, I just need to go faster. I can push the temperature more, then work more quickly and confidently. If it's both, I just need more practice, and I'll try to do both, but that will be the hardest. Mao nodded, following most of it, and even noticed the problem in Ronin's plan, both of them. So, who's got the other shards of Yamato? Probably the police. I'm hoping with UA, I can get them back eventually. Even if it's in lockup or the Hero Association, it shouldn't be too much for you. They've done dumber before. And how does any of that shit stop you from just using the broken sword to make portals? Midoriya faked a smile, then nodded. You just. Look, it's a little more complicated. Midoriya nodded along, trying to think how to phrase it. Well, it kind of isn't dash. Just use the demon thing. I don't give a sheet if it's snapped in 2 or 2 bajillion. That sheet is still OP as F dash. It's a crutch. I need to get better without it. If I'm a come to, I don't give a F if you gettin' better. I want you to have that broke as F sword. Well fine, then I'll bring the DMN sword. But I'm not using it on our raids. I don't want to break it more. Thank F dash. Mao shook his head, amazed. Seriously, the sheet you say? This isn't worth 2 rants in 10 minutes, Midoriya muttered, shaking his head as he finished off his drink, then glanced up at Mao. Also 12 o'clock. Usual place. Mao looked at him, confused, so Midoriya elaborated a bit. I'll bring Yamato, so you better hold up your end and show up to kick those kids' butts tomorrow, Midoriya explained, trying to hide his smirk. Got it? Oh, you slimy little sheet dash, Mao got a chuckle, shaking his head before ruffling Midoriya's hair. Give some punk an inch dash. Hey, you said it, not me. Midoriya got a genuine laugh as he kicked off the wall, grabbing his and Mao's things and heading for the bike. Now, they could plan the last few things when they met up at the usual spot tomorrow, and just ride it out from there. With only 1 day to go and a fix to finally help demonstrate fighting a bigger opponent, it all felt like smooth sailing, which is when Ronin should have learned was the best time to batten down the hatches. From putt-putt to home was just a hop, skip, and a jump, especially after the not-so-serious sparring they'd been doing today. He was a bit earlier than usual after some intense training, but checking his phone he had a missed call from his mom. Only one, so it couldn't have been that important. Besides, he only missed it by an hour. The door was unlocked, saving Midoriya the trouble of futzing around with a key. He walked into the apartment, smiling as he kicked off his shoes. "Mom, I'm home. Izuku, there you are. You're late." He heard his mom's voice calling from further in as he approached, leaving the entrance hall to see the ending of dinner. Didn't bother him too much. This was usual with his unusual arrival times. So he was late for dinner. He'd just take some leftovers, maybe a protein bar, and go to his. They weren't alone. It took Izuku too long to realize it wasn't just him and his mom in their little apartment, with two people sitting on the couch. One waving at him and the other actively ignoring him. "Hey, little rascal. Look who's all grown up." "What, Inko, did you forget to tell him we were coming over today?" "No, it just seems Izuku has his father's sense of timing," Inko huffed, pretending to be annoyed while shaking her head at Izuku. "Well, we've already eaten, but I'll heat up some leftovers for you. Go sit next to your friend, and I'll get the food, all right?" "Yep." Izuku's mouth became a thin line as he crossed the apartment, dropping his bag off near his door and slowly moving step by step towards the living room, his expression barely hiding the strange tension he felt as he moved onto his couch, his thoughts back-flitting through his memories. Did his mom tell him about this? Maybe something yesterday, when he'd been distracted by the alcohol. Even when he was sobered up, that alcohol was kicking his butt. With great resignation, Izuku sat himself on the couch next to Katsuki Bakugo, just a small ways down from Mitsuki Bakugo as his mother chatted animatedly from the kitchen. It was amazing, even when he didn't think he had plans, they all went horribly wrong.